I'm scared to go home. A woman whispered 3 words into her phone on a stormy night and accidentally sent them to the most dangerous man in the city. She wasn't looking for a savior. She was saying goodbye. But the man who received that message had spent 30 years making people disappear, and something in her voice made him stop everything. What happens when fear finds the wrong number, and the wrong number turns out to be the only right answer? Stay with me until the end of this story. If this one grips you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain came down like it had a grudge, not the soft, forgiving kind that washes streets clean and makes people nostalgic for something they can't name. This was the other kind, the kind that hammers against windows and bends trees sideways and fills gutters until they choke. The kind of rain that makes the city feel like it's trying to drown itself. Lena Ashford stood in the stairwell of her apartment building on the 4th floor of a 6-story walk-up in the Caldwell district, and she was shaking. Not from cold. The stairwell smelled like mildew and old carpet, and the particular staleness of a building that had been giving up for 20 years. A single fluorescent tube on the 3rd-floor landing buzzed and flickered, throwing the stairwell in and out of shadow every few seconds. She was 26 years old. She had spent the last 3 years telling herself things were going to get better. She had run out of that particular lie tonight. Her right cheekbone was swollen. Not split, not bleeding. Grant knew better than to leave marks where people could see them. He'd learned that years ago, back when she was a teenager and the school nurse had started asking questions he didn't want answered. The swelling was underneath the cheekbone, deep and dense. The kind that wouldn't be visible for another day or two. The kind that hurt worst when she tried to swallow. She pressed her back against the wall between the 3rd and 4th floor landings and pressed both palms flat against the plaster and tried to breathe. Her phone was in her hand. She'd had it in her hand when she ran. She didn't even remember picking it up. It was just there, like it had followed her out of the apartment on its own. She opened the voice memo app. She didn't know why. She wasn't going to call the police. She'd tried that twice in the past 18 months, and both times it had ended the same way. Officers arriving who knew Grant by first name, who shook his hand, who looked at Lena with flat professional eyes, and said something about domestic situations being complicated and left her alone in the apartment with a man who was very good at waiting. She wasn't going to call her mother. Her mother was dead. Had been for 4 years. She thought about calling Priya, who worked the overnight shift with her at Mercy General, and who had given her a look 3 weeks ago in the break room that said she knew something wasn't right. Priya's contact was somewhere in the middle of her list. She'd meant to move it to the top a dozen times. She'd never done it. She opened her contacts and scrolled too fast in the dark and hit the first name that looked right and held the phone up and started recording. Priya. Her voice came out wrong, thinner than she expected. It's me. I know this is weird. I know you're probably at the hospital right now. She stopped, pressed her free hand against her sternum, felt her pulse hammering against her ribs from the inside. I'm scared to go home. I don't know what he's going to do when I go back. If something happens to me, if I disappear, don't let them say I left. Don't let them say I just left, because I wouldn't. I would never just leave Eli. You know that. Whatever they say, you know that. A sound from somewhere above her. A door maybe, or just the building settling against the storm. And she stopped breathing for 3 full seconds. Then quieter. I just needed someone to know. She ended the recording. She hit send before she had time to rethink it. She looked down at her phone. The name on the sent message was not Priya. It was a contact saved under a string of numbers she didn't recognize. No name, no label, just 11 digits she had never dialed in her life. She stared at it for a long moment. Her first thought was that she'd somehow created a phantom contact, that her phone had glitched and generated a number out of noise. Her second thought was that she needed to figure out whose number it was and send an explanation before some stranger heard a frightened woman talking about disappearing and called the police for the wrong reasons. She didn't send an explanation. She couldn't make her fingers work well enough to type one. She locked her phone, shoved it in her jacket pocket, and pressed her forehead against the cool plaster wall of the stairwell and stayed there until she was sure her legs would hold her. Then she walked back upstairs to apartment 4C and she unlocked the door and she went inside. The phone that received the message was not a normal phone. It was a matte black handset with a custom operating system that had been stripped of everything non-essential. No social media, no GPS tracking, no app store, no cloud backup. The number was changed every 6 weeks. Fewer than 12 people in the world had the current one. It had never received a message from an unknown contact before, because unknown contacts didn't have the number. Damien Viscari was sitting at a desk in a townhouse in the Sinclair Hill neighborhood when the message came in, and for several seconds he simply looked at the notification without touching it. Unknown number, voice message, 37 seconds. He was 41 years old. He had a face that people remembered wrong, not because it was forgettable, but because something about his stillness made witnesses second-guess their own perception afterward. Medium height, lean, with the kind of quiet that wasn't peace but its opposite, the quiet of someone who was always listening, always measuring, and never once surprised. He should have deleted it without listening. That was the correct response to an unknown contact on an encrypted handset. His security director would have told him the same thing without hesitation. Unknown number, voice message, 37 seconds. Delete, report the breach, rotate the number. He played it instead. He listened to it once all the way through without moving. Then he played it again. Then a third time. He set the phone face down on the desk and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. He'd heard fear before. Fear was common in his line of work. It was practically ambient, a background frequency he'd long ago stopped registering. He'd heard people beg, cry, bargain, collapse. He'd been the cause of it, directly and indirectly, more times than he'd ever bothered to count. This wasn't that. This wasn't performative fear, the kind that arrives in a rush and pitches high and needs an audience. This was the voice of someone who had already been living with the worst of it for so long that the fear had gone quiet, gone underground. The trembling wasn't panic, it was exhaustion. If I disappear, don't let them say I left. He picked the phone back up and ran a trace on the number. It took his technical contact 11 minutes to return a name. Lena Ashford, age 26, licensed pediatric nurse, Mercy General Hospital. Current address: Apartment 4C, 1140 Renwick Street, Caldwell District. He sat with that information for another 15 minutes before he picked up a different phone, a secondary line, older, less protected, and made a quiet call. "I need eyes on a residential building," he said when the line connected. "Caldwell. I'll send the address, passive only. I want to know what's happening before I decide what I want to know." Marcus Teal had been doing surveillance work for 6 years. He was good at it because he was average in every way that mattered. Average height, average build, average face. The kind of man people looked at and immediately forgot. He drove a 10-year-old gray sedan with a cracked rear bumper, and he parked it across the street from 1140 Renwick at midnight and settled in with a coffee thermos and a pair of compact binoculars. He called Damien at 2:17 a.m. "She came out twice," he said. "Once to the corner store, bought Band-Aids and an ice pack. Paid cash, kept her head down. Second time just to stand outside in the rain for a few minutes. Not smoking, just standing." A pause. "There's a man in that apartment. I ran the plates on the vehicle in the resident lot. Registered to a Grant Holloway. Nothing obvious in public records, but he drives a $40,000 truck on a neighborhood that doesn't pay for $40,000 trucks." Damien said nothing for a moment. "The woman, she go back inside?" "Both times." "Anything else?" "Lights went out around 1. No sounds, no activity since." Another pause. "She looked scared, coming and going. Not the kind of scared that shows. The kind that hides." Damien ended the call. He didn't sleep that night. This was not unusual. He slept poorly most nights and functioned fine on 4 or 5 hours, a habit developed over decades of necessity. But tonight was different. Tonight he sat in his study with a glass of bourbon he didn't drink, and he played Lena Ashford's voice message 4 more times, and he thought about a woman who bought Band-Aids at midnight and stood in the rain because going back inside was better than wherever her mind went when she was alone. By morning, he had made a decision. He would have been unable to fully articulate why. He was not a sentimental man, had not been one for a very long time. had learned early that sentiment was a liability in his world and had excised it accordingly. But something in that recording had bypassed whatever filter he'd built over decades, landed somewhere underneath the architecture of who he'd made himself into, and refused to be ignored. He told Marcus to expand the surveillance. He told his finance contact to run a deeper trace on Grant Holloway. He made clear to both men that this was a quiet operation. No footprint, no flag, no action without his direct approval. Then he went about his day and pretended he wasn't thinking about a woman he had never met. What the deeper trace on Holloway returned was not domestic. It took 4 days. During those 4 days, Lena went to work 3 of them, came home at predictable times, kept her head down in the way of someone who had long ago learned to minimize their profile. Marcus tracked her with the thoroughness of a man who understood that details mattered. He noted when she walked faster. He noted when she took the long route home. He noted the one afternoon she sat on the steps of a diner 2 blocks from her building for 40 minutes, just sitting, the way people sit when they're steeling themselves for something. On the 4th day, Damien's finance contact sent him a file. He read it at his desk with the overhead light on and the curtains drawn and a cold cup of coffee at his elbow. And as he read, the expression on his face didn't change, but something in his posture did, the slight forward shift of a man who has found something he wasn't expecting. Grant Holloway was not a neighborhood abuser with a temper problem and a nice truck. Grant Holloway had been operating a sophisticated blackmail network across a 7-county radius for the better part of a decade. The mechanism was elegant in its cruelty. He identified families with vulnerabilities, financial troubles, legal exposure, undocumented members, medical debts, secrets of the kind that destroyed careers and marriages. And he collected that information through a network of low-level informants embedded in social services offices, hospital billing departments, and local government. Then he used it. Monthly payments, compliance on demand, silence maintained through periodic demonstrations of what happened when someone declined to comply. 6 businesses in Caldwell District alone were laundering money through Holloway's network. 3 of them were fronts that didn't bother pretending to have real customers. He had 2 city council members, a family court judge, and at least 4 police officers on a quiet retainer that never appeared in any financial record that would survive a basic audit. Lena's mother had known about it. Damien's contact had dug deep enough to find a death certificate, 4 years prior, ruled a cardiac event, and a pattern of payments to a private medical facility in the months before that ruling that didn't match any insurance claim on file. Damien sat back from the desk. He thought about Lena standing in the rain at 1 a.m, not smoking, just existing outside her apartment for a few minutes before going back in. He thought about what she'd said on that voice message. Whatever they say, you know that. She already knew. Maybe not all of it, maybe not the full architecture of what Holloway had built, but she knew enough to understand that if something happened to her, the official story would be controlled. She was protecting her brother. A detail his contact had also surfaced. Elias Ashford, 19 years old, learning disability, currently living in the same apartment with Holloway and Lena, because there was nowhere else for him to go. She was 26 years old, and she was holding herself between a predator and her 19-year-old brother with the full understanding that the system around them was compromised. Don't let them say I left. Damien stood up from the desk and walked to the window and stood with his hands in his pockets looking out at the street below. Then he walked back to the desk and picked up his phone and called Marcus. I want 24-hour coverage, he said. Rotating. 3 people minimum, never the same face twice in a week. And I want someone inside the building. Find me a pretext. Marcus said, This is escalating. I know what it is, Damien said. Who is she to you? There was a pause that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then Damien said, Someone who sent the wrong number a message, and hung up. Lena first noticed the black SUV 8 days after she sent the voice message. She was walking home from the night shift. She'd taken 4 in a row to pick up extra income because Holloway had taken most of what she'd saved in the previous month without explanation, and she needed to rebuild before the rent came due. And it was early morning, the city in that particular exhausted pre-dawn state that felt less like quiet and more like the absence of noise. The SUV was parked at the corner of Renwick and Aldine. Not unusual, but she'd seen it at the corner 2 blocks east the morning before. She hadn't consciously registered it at the time. Now she did. She kept walking. She didn't stop or change pace. She'd learned a long time ago not to react to things she wasn't sure about, because reacting created evidence of awareness, and awareness was a provocation. Inside apartment 4C, she found Eli asleep on the couch with the television on, volume low, some nature documentary about birds. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him, his face slack and young and free of whatever it carried when he was awake. And she felt the familiar combination of love and fury and weight that she'd been living inside for 3 years. Holloway wasn't home. She noted this the way she noted all his absences. Relief first, then the secondary anxiety of not knowing when he'd return. She went to the bathroom and ran cold water over her wrists and looked at herself in the mirror for a while. She looked like herself, which she found faintly surprising every morning. She expected the accumulated weight of the last few years to be more visible. She expected her face to show it more. But she just looked tired, in the specific way of someone who worked night shifts and didn't sleep enough, and nothing in her reflection announced anything unusual about her circumstances. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. In the morning, she found a note slipped under the front door, her overdue gas bill, with a handwritten notation that it had been paid. Anonymous. The utility company, she knew, would have no useful information about who had done it. She stared at the note for a long time. Then she thought about the black SUV, about the figure she'd caught a glimpse of 2 nights ago, standing in the shadow of the parking garage across from her building, too still to be someone waiting for a ride, too positioned to be coincidental. She'd looked directly at the shadow and then looked away and kept walking, because that was what you did. Somebody was watching her. The question was whether that somebody was connected to Holloway, whether he'd put surveillance on her the way a man like him might, to monitor her compliance, to track her movements, to know if she was talking to anyone she shouldn't be. The alternative question, which she allowed herself to think about only briefly before shutting it back down, was whether whoever was watching her had a different motivation. One that wasn't hostile. One that might, improbably, be something else. She thought about the voice message. She thought about the wrong number she'd sent it to. She thought about whether anyone had listened. She did not allow herself to hope. She had learned, through repeated and specific instruction from the world, that hope was the thing that made the falls hurt worse. She went to work. She came home. She noticed the SUV again, different corner, same practice stillness. She noticed that Holloway had been distracted the past few days, taking calls in the bathroom, coming home late, with the particular edginess of a man who sensed something was wrong but hadn't located the source yet. She didn't know what was happening around her. She didn't know that her gas bill had been paid by an anonymous wire transfer arranged by a man she'd never met. She didn't know that a quiet, methodical dismantling of Grant Holloway's financial network had begun, in careful increments, 3 days earlier. She didn't know that 2 of Holloway's embedded informants inside local government had been quietly confronted with evidence of their activities and given an ultimatum that had nothing to do with law enforcement. She only knew that the world felt different, in a way she couldn't articulate, in a way that was either the beginning of something or a very specific kind of cruelty. She was beginning to be afraid to hope, and afraid not to, in equal measure. The attempted kidnapping happened on a Thursday. She was working a half shift, covering for a colleague who'd called out sick, and she left Mercy General at just past 9 in the evening, earlier than usual, unexpected, the kind of variation from routine that she normally avoided but that couldn't be helped. She took her usual route for the first 3 blocks and then cut through the side street by the parking structure the way she sometimes did when the traffic on the main avenue was bad and the exhaust made her head hurt. The car came from behind. It wasn't unusual for a car to come from behind. That was the direction cars came from, on a one-way street. But the pace was wrong, too slow. The deliberate hunting pace of a vehicle tracking a specific target. She didn't run. Running was worse, it confirmed awareness. It escalated. She kept walking, slightly faster, toward the lit intersection at the end of the block. The car kept pace. 2 men. She registered this from her peripheral vision. 2 men in the front seat, the passenger door beginning to open while they were still moving. She had time to think, with a strange, almost clinical detachment. He decided not to wait. What happened next happened fast. A figure. Not one of the men in the car, someone else. Someone who had been standing in the entrance of the parking structure in the same shadow she'd stopped registering as unusual, stepped directly into the passenger door as it opened, and there was a sharp physical collision, the door slamming back against the man stepping out, and then the figure had one hand on Lena's arm and was moving with her toward the far side of the structure's entrance, away from the car, with the absolute purposeful velocity of someone executing a plan. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She went with him because the alternative was the car, and the car was worse. They went into the parking structure, through a service door she hadn't known was there, into a stairwell that smelled like concrete and motor oil. The man with her stopped. He was breathing hard, controlled, someone managing exertion. She stopped too, pressing herself against the wall. She looked at him properly for the first time. He was not what she would have expected if someone had asked her to imagine a guardian angel, which she wouldn't have, because that wasn't a category she believed in. He was in his 40s, somewhere in that range, with dark eyes and a face that was still rather than calm, an important distinction, the difference between someone at peace and someone holding something very quiet and very large inside them at all times. He was dressed plainly. He looked at her with an expression that she couldn't categorize, which was unusual. She was good at reading expressions. She'd had to be. He said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "No." He said, "Good." She said, "Who are you?" He looked at her for a moment. He had the manner of someone who had answered this question in many different ways over many years and had stopped believing most of the available answers were useful. Someone who got a voice message, he said, that wasn't meant for them. The stairwell was quiet. Outside somewhere, the car had moved on. She could no longer hear its engine. Rain was beginning again. She could hear it hitting the concrete of the upper levels. She stared at him. She thought about the voice message. She thought about the wrong number. She thought about all the things that had been slightly different over the past 11 days, the paid bill, the feeling of being watched, the presence she'd convinced herself she was imagining. "You've been watching me," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "Why?" He said, "Because I listened to what you said, and I didn't think I should stop listening." She kept her eyes on him. She was trying to figure out if she was in a different kind of danger, whether moving from one threat to another was what was happening here. She was good at reading people, but something about his stillness was genuinely difficult to read. Not deceptive, not performed, just dense. Like there was more to him than was visible on the surface, and the surface wasn't giving anything away. "Who are you?" she asked again. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "My name is Damien," and offered nothing else. "That's not an answer to the question I asked." "No," he said, "it's not." She thought about Eli, at home, asleep on the couch with the nature documentary on. She thought about Holloway, with his edginess and his bathroom phone calls and his $40,000 truck. "Grant sent those men," she said. Damien said, "He thinks someone's been interfering with his operation. He's trying to neutralize variables." A pause. "You're a variable." She absorbed this. The word variable, the cold precision of it, the way it described exactly how Grant thought about the people in his orbit, landed in her chest with a dull, familiar weight. She'd known it, but hearing it stated plainly by someone outside her life made it more real and less survivable at the same time. "He has people everywhere," she said. "Police, judges. If something happens to me, I know what he has," Damien said. "I know more than you do right now about what he's built." She looked at him. "And what are you going to do with that?" He met her eyes, and there was something in his expression that was the most honest thing she'd seen in a very long time, because it wasn't reassurance, wasn't comfort, wasn't the performance of someone telling her what she needed to hear. It was just directness, flat and clear and specific. "I'm going to take it apart," he said. Outside, the rain was coming down harder now. She could hear it above them, a sustained percussion on concrete and steel. She thought about another night, not so different from this one, when she'd stood in a stairwell and held a phone and recorded something she'd never meant anyone to hear. She said, "My brother is in that apartment." Damien said, "I know." She said, "He can't protect himself." Damien said, "I know that too." She looked at him for another long moment. This man with his dense stillness and his single-word answers, and the particular quality of someone who had been in this kind of situation many times before, who understood what it cost and did it anyway, or had once and couldn't undo the shape it had made of him. "I don't know what you are," she said. "I don't know if I should trust you." "You shouldn't," he said simply. "You don't know me. Trust me when you have a reason to." It was the right answer. The fact that it was the right answer made it harder to know what to do with. In the distance, through the concrete walls of the parking structure, a car alarm began, then cut off. The rain kept coming. Lena's pulse was coming down from the sprint level it had hit on the street, settling back towards something manageable, and her mind was working now, running the calculations she'd gotten good at running. Risks, options, what she had to work with, what she didn't. She had nothing. She had $32 in her account until next payday. She had a brother who needed protecting. She had a stepfather who had just sent men to grab her off the street. She had a stranger in a stairwell who had been watching over her for 11 days and had just stepped between her and a car full of Holloway's people without hesitation and without asking anything in return. She pulled her jacket tighter. Her hand was still shaking slightly, not much, just at the fingertips. "What happens now?" she asked. Damien reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small card. Plain white, just a phone number, no name. "You call that number if anything changes," he said. "If Holloway says anything unusual, if Eli is moved, if anything feels different than the worst it's already been." He paused. "Don't go back to the apartment tonight. Is there anywhere else you can stay?" "I can't leave Eli there alone with him." "Holloway won't be in the apartment tonight." There was no elaboration. It was stated as fact. She looked at the card. She thought about all the decisions she'd made in the last 3 years that had been no decision at all. Acceptance, endurance, the grinding daily work of keeping things from getting worse. She thought about the voice message she'd sent by mistake to a number she didn't recognize, and the particular impossible irony of the fact that it had led her here. She took the card. She held it between her fingers and looked at it, and then looked at Damien and thought, "I don't know what you are, but you're the first thing that's happened that isn't worse." She tucked the card into her jacket pocket, right next to where her phone was, right next to the contact she'd accidentally created, the number she hadn't meant to dial, the message she hadn't meant to send. "Okay," she said. Damien nodded. He moved toward the stairwell door, checked the landing through a narrow window, held it open. She walked through. Behind her, she heard him follow, quiet as a man who had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing about him was the sound he didn't make. And somewhere in the structure above them, a phone buzzed in his pocket, and she heard him answer it in a voice low enough that she couldn't make out the words, and whatever he heard made him go very still for just a moment before he continued walking. Whatever that phone call contained, she didn't know yet. She didn't know that 3 blocks away, one of Holloway's financial fronts had just been hit with an anonymous report to the Federal Financial Crimes Division, or that the officer Holloway had on retainer to handle exactly this kind of situation had picked up his own phone 10 minutes earlier to find evidence of his arrangement delivered directly to his precinct commander's inbox. She didn't know that the careful dismantling she'd been unknowingly walking through for 11 days had just shifted into something faster and less careful. She didn't know that somewhere in that shift, the situation had developed a momentum that was going to take everything from quiet to something neither of them was entirely ready for, and that Holloway, even now, was figuring out the same thing. She walked out of the stairwell and into the rain and thought, "I'm still scared to go home." What she didn't know yet, what she was about to find out in ways that would strip every remaining illusion from her understanding of the world she'd been surviving, was that home, the apartment, the address on Renwick Street, was about to stop being the thing she needed to be afraid of. Something much larger than a man with a temper and a $40,000 truck was coming into focus, and Damien Vescari, walking 2 steps behind her in the rain, had already seen it. They met the next morning, not at a restaurant, not at an office. Damien's text at 6:42 a.m. gave her an address in the warehouse district south of the rail yards, a part of the city that the blizzard had buried clean, and when she arrived in a cab just after 7, the snow was still falling in thin, exhausted flurries, the storm finally spending itself out. The building had no signage. A man she didn't recognize opened the steel door before she knocked and led her through a hallway that smelled like concrete and machine oil into a room in the back that had been set up incongruously, like a place where work happened. A long table, folding chairs, a portable space heater doing its best against the cold, and on the table, arranged in neat rows, a collection of documents, photographs, and printed spreadsheets that stopped her breathing. Damien was already there, standing at the far end of the table, coat still on, holding a paper cup of coffee that he hadn't drunk from. He watched her come in and look at what was on the table. "Sit down," he said. She didn't sit. She walked to the table and picked up the nearest photograph. It was Trevor outside a building she didn't recognize. A mid-range glass and steel office tower, talking to a man in a gray coat whose face was half turned from the camera. The timestamp in the lower corner read 3 months ago. "Who took this?" she said. "My people." "Last night you ran a background check on me," she said. "Between the car and my building. That's about 4 minutes." "3," he said. She set the photograph down. "So this," she gestured at the table, "this isn't last night's work." "No." She looked at him. "You knew about Trevor before you stopped to pick me up." Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt exactly, something more careful than that. "I knew a name," he said. "I didn't know the connection until my people ran yours." "What name?" "Trevor Hale has debt," Damien said. He came around to her side of the table and picked up a different sheet, a printout, columns of numbers with dates. "Gambling debt, not the social kind. The serious kind with people who attach very specific consequences to non-payment." He said it in front of her. "He owes $460,000 across 3 separate creditors. All of them are connected to operations I'm aware of. 2 of those creditors have been pushing for resolution for 6 months." Elena looked at the numbers. She was a nurse. She understood debt in the abstract. Medical school loans, the mortgage they'd taken on the apartment before realizing it was too expensive and downgrading to the rental, the car payments. But the figures on this sheet were not abstract. They were detailed, dated, specific, and they described a man she had lived with for 4 years who had, apparently, been living a second financial life entirely parallel to the one she thought they shared. "How?" she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "Online betting, mostly. Started small. There's a progression here." He pointed to the earliest date on the sheet, 14 months ago. "Then it accelerated. By last spring, he was down over 200,000 and trying to cover it with more bets. Classic pattern." "And the insurance," she said. He reached for a different document. She stopped him. "Just tell me," she said. "Don't show me yet. Just say it." He looked at her. The heater ticked in the corner. Outside, the muffled city moved through its buried morning. "He increased your life insurance policy 11 months ago," Damien said, "without telling you. The policy names him as sole beneficiary. The payout is $1.2 million. The number sat in the room between them. "He forged my signature," she said. It wasn't a question. Because she had not signed anything 11 months ago that she was aware of, she had not discussed any insurance changes. She would have remembered. "The signature on the policy application doesn't match your current records," he said. "We compared it." Elena put her hands flat on the table and looked at the spread of documents and photographs. And she breathed. The way she breathed in the trauma bay when she needed to stay functional, 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out. And she let the information settle into place with the terrible logic of a diagnosis she'd been missing because she hadn't been looking for it. The distraction, the financial mail he'd been handling, the accident last September that she'd written off as bad luck. She'd slipped on the basement stairs of their old building and broken 2 ribs, and Trevor had been so attentive afterward, so concerned, and she had been grateful. She had been grateful. The basement stairs. "There was an accident," she said. Damien said nothing, which was its own answer. "Last September, I fell down a flight of stairs." "I know." She looked up at him. "How much do you know?" "Enough," he said. "Elena." The first time he'd used her name. It landed differently than she expected, the specific weight of it. Not soft, not kind, but present. Like he was making sure she was still in the room. "The fall was investigated. Briefly. Standard incident report, nothing flagged, but the staircase was in a building where your husband had management access. The dry cleaning service he uses is in that building. He had a key. The space heater ticked. She pulled out the nearest chair and sat down. Not because she was tired. She'd slept 4 hours and come straight here on adrenaline. But because her legs had made a unilateral decision. She sat with her hands in her lap and she looked at the surface of the table and she did the thing she'd trained herself to do with unbearable information, which was to stop trying to feel it immediately and instead just let it exist, solid and present, until she could find an edge to begin. "He's going to try again," she said. "Yes." "When?" Damien picked up a piece of paper from the far end of the table and brought it to her. It was a printout of a text conversation. She recognized Trevor's number in the header. The other number was unidentified. The messages were dated 4 days ago. She read them. The conversation was not explicit. It didn't need to be. Two people discussing logistics. A date, a location, a reference to weather conditions being ideal, a comment about the policy being fully activated as of the previous month. The other person responded with a number, 40,000. She set the paper down. "Who is the other number?" she said. "We're working on it, mid-level, someone with a specific skill set that gets contracted." She looked at Damien directly. "You're going to want something from me," she said. "That's why you called last night. That's why I'm here." He met her eyes. He didn't hedge. "Yes." "What?" He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, the first time he'd been at her level since she'd come in. Up close, in the flat gray winter light coming through the high windows, he looked like someone who had been awake longer than she had. Not tired. That wasn't the word. Worn in a specific way, a cumulative way, the way people look when they have been maintaining something at high cost for a very long time. "Trevor trusts you," he said. "He doesn't know you know. That window is narrow and it closes fast. People in his position get paranoid. They make moves early if they sense something's shifted. I need you to go home, behave normally, and give us 72 hours to build the documentation we need to take to the right people." "The right people," she said. "Which people?" "I have a federal contact," he said. "This crosses enough jurisdictions, insurance fraud, conspiracy, for hire arrangement, that it doesn't stay local. But local doesn't move on Trevor Hale without a chain of custody that's airtight, because Trevor has connections to people in local enforcement who will help things disappear." He said this without particular emphasis, as if it were a weather condition rather than an accusation. "Federal is cleaner." She absorbed this. "And in 72 hours? We have enough to hand over. They move, he's done, and you're done. Clean." "And if something happens in 72 hours?" she said. "If he decides to accelerate?" "He won't." Damien said it with a flatness that made her want to believe it. "Not while I have eyes on him." "You have eyes on him now?" "Since last night." She thought about this. About Trevor on the couch, comfortable, television low, phone face up. About him watching her come in from the storm he'd left her in. About his voice saying, "That's on you, honestly." "I need to know something," she said. "Go ahead." "Why does this matter to you?" She held his gaze. "You don't know me. You picked me up in a blizzard because... what? You felt like it? That's not a real reason. You're a careful person. You don't do things without reasons." The silence that followed was the longest he'd given her. She watched him decide something. "Trevor's creditors," he said finally. "2 of the 3 operations he owes money to, they're on my territory." He said it simply, without inflection, the way you state a fact about geography. "When someone in my territory runs a murder for insurance scheme and the body drops, that becomes a problem I inherit. Investigations, attention, heat on operations that are currently running quietly. I don't need any of that." He paused. "And I don't need a woman dying because her husband has a gambling problem and a lack of imagination." Elena looked at him for a long time. "That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in about a year," she said. Something that was not quite a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. "Get used to it," he said. "It's the only register I operate in." She went home. The apartment felt like a foreign country. Same furniture, same smells, same thin winter light through the east-facing windows. But all of it altered by what she now knew, the way a familiar room looks different after the power goes out and comes back. Trevor was in the kitchen when she came in, making coffee, and he turned and looked at her with an expression she read now with completely different instruments. "Where were you?" he said. Not accusatory, casual. The performance of someone who had no reason to be suspicious. "Coffee with a colleague," she said. "Marta from the ICU floor. She called early." She took her coat off and hung it on the hook by the door, making her movements normal. "Did you eat?" "Just coffee for now." She went to the kitchen and poured herself a cup and stood at the counter and looked out the window at the snow-buried backyard, and she felt him watching her in the way she'd started to feel over the last months. That particular quality of attention, the calculating kind that she'd mistaken for indifference. He wasn't indifferent. He'd never been indifferent. He was measuring. "You seem better," he said. "I slept," she said. "Finally. Good." He picked up his phone. "I've got a thing tonight. Might be late." "Okay," she said. The ease with which the lie left her mouth frightened her slightly. She carried her coffee to the living room and sat by the window and watched the street below, while Trevor moved through the apartment behind her. The sounds of his morning, the shower, the closet, the specific rhythm of him she'd learned over 4 years without choosing to. And she sat with the knowledge of what he was and what he was planning, and she stayed completely still. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number she recognized as the one Damien had used. "Package delivered to your building's mailroom. Blue envelope. Your name." She waited until Trevor left. The mailroom was a lockered alcove off the lobby, and the blue envelope was in the open intake tray unlocked. She brought it upstairs. Inside was a prepaid phone, a folded sheet with 3 numbers written by hand, and a note in economical handwriting. "Use only this for contact. Your phone is a liability." She stood in her kitchen and turned the prepaid phone over in her hands. Then she went to the bathroom, locked the door, and called the first number on the sheet. Damien picked up on the second ring. "You made it back fine?" "He was already in the kitchen," she said. "How was he?" "Normal. He said he has a thing tonight." She paused. He said it the way he always says it, like I'm supposed to just accept that. "You accept it," Damien said. "Tonight you accept all of it." "I know." She exhaled. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." "Go ahead." "The person in those texts," she said, "the other number, the $40,000, is that a person who has already been paid, or is it someone who's waiting?" A pause. Waiting. The word moved through her like cold water. "So there is an active contract," she said. "Yes." "And you have eyes on Trevor?" "Yes." "But not on the contractor." Another pause, slightly longer. "We're locating him." "Damien." She pressed her back against the bathroom wall. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "If you don't know where this person is, then having eyes on Trevor doesn't fully cover it. Trevor doesn't have to be present for something to happen to me." Silence. "I know," he said. "So I need to know how exposed I am right now, specifically." "Somewhat," he said. The honesty of it was brutal in its simplicity. "Which is why you're going to change your routine. I'm going to have 2 people on you starting tonight. You won't see them, but they'll be there." She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. She looked like someone who had slept 4 hours after a 14-hour shift and then spent the morning being told that her husband was trying to have her killed. She looked, she thought, remarkably functional for that person. "Okay," she said. "Elena." His voice, low and even. "You're handling this well." "I'm in a bathroom," she said, "talking to a man I met in a blizzard about whether my husband has already hired someone to kill me. I'm not handling anything. I'm just still upright." The closest thing to warmth she'd heard from him yet. "Same thing," he said. She went back to the living room. She sat. She waited. The day was long in the way of days that require constant performance. She went to the grocery store at 11. She needed to do it anyway, and it gave her a reason to move. And she walked the aisles of the supermarket 3 blocks from the apartment with a basket and a list and the awareness, new and strange, that somewhere in this ordinary afternoon scenery there were people watching her building, watching Trevor, watching for a person she didn't have a face for yet. She bought pasta and garlic, and a rotisserie chicken and stood in the checkout line behind a woman with a full cart and a toddler in the seat, and she thought about the staircase, the September stairs, the two ribs. She had been so grateful for how attentive he'd been. Trevor came home at 9:30 that night, and she'd made dinner and kept his portion warm, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and he talked about work, the particular vagueness he'd developed, the non-specific anecdotes that conveyed activity without detail. And she listened and nodded and refilled his water glass, and she was so present in her performance of normalcy that she almost missed the moment his phone buzzed and he glanced at it and something crossed his face that he killed too quickly. She didn't react. She talked about a patient, a composite, fictional, built from her clinical vocabulary. And he listened with half his attention, and under the table she pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her finger hard enough to stay sharp. That night, lying in the dark beside him, she listened to him breathe himself to sleep, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about all the small moments of the last 11 months that she had cataloged and accepted and explained away. The way he'd started handling all the mail, the life insurance conversation that hadn't happened because he'd signed her name instead of having it, the accident that wasn't, the text she'd read on the borrowed phone that evening, relayed from Damien's team. Trevor Hale placed one call from a burner device at approximately 2100 hours. Duration 4 minutes. Call matched to the unidentified number from the prior intercept. Working on location trace. 4 minutes. While she'd been doing dishes, and he'd excused himself to check on something in the other room. By day 2, she had learned how to inhabit the performance without losing the thread underneath it. She went to a half shift at the hospital. She'd called in sick yesterday, first time in 2 years, and moved through the ER with the discipline that 7 years of practice had given her. And if any of her colleagues noticed she was running at a different frequency, they attributed it to the blizzard and the missed shift and let it go. She checked the prepaid phone twice from the bathroom during her shift. No contact. The second contact came at 3 in the afternoon while she was changing out of her scrubs. Not from Damien. From a number she didn't recognize on her regular phone. A text. You need to be careful about who you're talking to, Elena. Some people are dangerous. She read it twice. Then she photographed the screen with the prepaid phone and sent it to Damien's number. His response came 40 seconds later. Don't reply, don't delete. We got it. How are you? She stared at that last question. 2 words that didn't fit the register of everything else. Functional, she typed back. Good, he said. And then, after a pause, 2 more hours. We have the contractor's location. She exhaled in the hospital bathroom with her back against the door and felt the first genuine loosening in 48 hours. 2 more hours. Then the federal contact. Then this would begin to close. She was pulling on her coat when her phone rang. Her regular phone. Trevor's name on the screen. She answered. Hey. Hey. His voice was different, not casual. Something underneath it that her ear caught and her stomach registered before her mind did. Where are you? Just leaving the hospital. Why? I was thinking we could have dinner out tonight, that Italian place you like on Mercer. She went very still. Trevor didn't make dinner reservations. Trevor didn't initiate evenings out. In the last 6 months, the only times they'd eaten outside the apartment were occasions she'd organized or occasions driven by some external event. Sure, she said. She kept her voice warm. Natural. That sounds nice. 7 o'clock, he said. I'll meet you there. He hung up before she could respond. She was already typing on the prepaid phone. Trevor just called. Dinner tonight, 7 p.m., restaurant on Mercer. He's never suggested before. He said he'll meet me there, not come home first. Damien's response took 90 seconds, long enough that she knew he was talking to someone. Don't go. Call him back in 10 minutes and cancel. Tell him you're not feeling well. Do it naturally. She walked to the elevator. Why? The response came as she pressed the lobby button. The restaurant on Mercer is 2 blocks from the parking structure where the contractor's phone last pinged. Trevor doesn't know we have that location. He's moving early. The elevator reached the lobby, and the doors opened, and Elena Cross stood in the bright, warm hospital lobby with her coat half buttoned and the prepaid phone in her hand, and the understanding settling into her bones that 72 hours had just become tonight, and that Trevor, her husband, the man who had promised to pick her up in a blizzard, had decided he was done waiting. She put the prepaid phone in her pocket. She put her regular phone to her ear. She called Trevor back with 10 minutes to spare, and when he answered, she said, in a voice she built from the ground up out of pure performance, "Hey, actually, I'm not feeling great. Can we do tomorrow instead?" A pause. Too long for a simple schedule adjustment. "Sure," he said. Tomorrow's fine." She hung up. She walked out of the hospital into the sharp cold, and she dialed Damien. He picked up on the first ring. "You did well." He paused, she said, before he agreed. "I know, we were listening." She stopped walking. "You have my phone. We have a mirror since yesterday morning. I should have told you." Not an apology exactly, the statement of a person correcting an omission. "I'm sorry." She stood on the cleared hospital sidewalk with the late afternoon city noise around her, traffic, wind, the distant scrape of a snowplow, and she processed the information that her regular phone had been monitored for 36 hours by a man she'd met in a blizzard 48 hours ago, and she found, when she looked for outrage, that it wasn't there. What was there was something more pragmatic and more frightening: relief. "Where's the contractor now?" she said. "Mobile," he said. "Moving toward your neighborhood." The air in her lungs went thin. "Elena," his voice low and controlled, "get in a cab. Right now. Don't go back to the apartment. I'm texting you an address." "My things are—" "Leave them." It wasn't a suggestion. "You can buy new things. Get in a cab." She was already moving toward the curb, hand up. A cab was right there. She felt the coincidence of it and didn't stop to examine it, because some coincidences are not coincidences, and she was beginning to understand the operational texture of the world she'd stepped into 2 nights ago in a blizzard. She got in. She gave the driver the address Damien had sent. The cab pulled into traffic, and she watched the sidewalk outside the window, and she held herself very still and did not look at her phone, and breathed the way she breathed in the trauma bay when something had just gone wrong and was still going wrong. And the only thing standing between a patient and the worst outcome was her ability to stay functional in the middle of it. 20 minutes later, the cab stopped in front of a building she didn't recognize. She paid, got out. The steel door opened before she reached it. Inside, Damien. And 2 other men she hadn't seen before, calm, positioned, the specific stillness of people waiting for instructions to become actions. And across the room, sitting in a chair with his hands on his knees, and the expression of a man who has just made the worst miscalculation of his life, was someone she did not know. Young, mid-30s maybe. Ordinary looking in the way of people who are meant to be ordinary looking, with the kind of face that didn't stick in memory. He had the contractor's build. Not large, not obvious, but held in a specific way. She stopped in the doorway. Damien looked at her, then at the man in the chair. "He's going to tell you something," Damien said, "and then we're going to make a call." The man in the chair looked up at her. His expression was not what she expected. Not hostile, not defiant. He looked, she thought, like someone who had done a very careful calculation and arrived at the conclusion that cooperation was the only version of tonight that worked out for him. "Trevor Hale hired me 6 weeks ago," he said. His voice was flat, factual, the voice of a man dictating terms rather than confessing. "The arrangement was $40,000 up front, 40 on completion. I took the first payment. Tonight was the scheduled date." He paused. "He moved it up by 2 days without telling me. I don't work that way, so here I am." Elena looked at him for a long time. "He moved it up," she said, "because of me." The man said nothing, which was all the answer she needed. She turned to Damien. He was watching her with that focused, unreadable attention. "You said 72 hours, she said. "It's closer to 18 now," he said. She looked at the man in the chair. She looked at the 2 men standing at the perimeter. She looked at Damien, who had stopped a convoy in a blizzard for reasons that were half operational and half something else she still didn't fully have a name for. "Okay," she said. Her voice was very steady. "Then we don't wait for 72 hours. We move tonight." Damien held her gaze. "If we move tonight," he said carefully, "there's no clean handoff. The federal contact needs lead time. We go tonight, we go without a net." "I know," she said. "If something goes wrong, Damien." She cut him off, not sharply, precisely. My husband accelerated his plan to have me killed because I canceled dinner. I don't have 72 hours. I don't have 18. What do we have right now, tonight, that we can actually use? The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the city, Trevor Hale was sitting with his phone and the knowledge that his wife had canceled dinner and the slowly forming realization that something had shifted in the architecture of the plan he'd been building for 11 months. Damien reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small recorder. The old kind, compact, analog, the kind that couldn't be hacked or remotely accessed, and set it on the table between them. "A conversation," he said. "We need Trevor on record. Specifically, we need him to say it himself, the insurance, the contract, the intent. Recorded, time-stamped, corroborated by the man in that chair." He nodded at the contractor. "With that, we don't need 72 hours. We need one phone call." She looked at the recorder. "He won't say it on the phone to me," she said. "Not in explicit terms. He's been careful." "Not to you," Damien said. "To me." She looked up. "Trevor knows my name," Damien said. "He's known it was connected to your rescue since the night of the blizzard. He's been trying to establish me as a threat to you. Manipulation, exploitation. He's been building that narrative to isolate you." His expression was level. "We use that. He gets a call from my number tonight. He's told I know what he's been doing. He's told the contractor is no longer available. He's told the only way this stays quiet is if he confirms the arrangement directly, because his partner needs proof before he walks." "His partner," she said. "You mean you're going to pretend to be in on it with him?" "I'm going to let him think he can buy his way to silence," Damien said. "Men like Trevor don't run when they think they can pay their way out. They talk. They always talk." He picked up the recorder and turned it over in his hand. "And when he talks, it's over." Elena Cross stood in that cold back room with the space heater going and a hired killer sitting in a chair 10 feet away, and the most dangerous man she'd ever met laying out a plan that depended on her husband's greed and his assumption that everyone had a price. And she felt the full weight of the path she'd been walking since she got into a black SUV in a blizzard because she couldn't feel her fingers. She reached out and picked up the recorder, turned it over once, set it back down. "Make the call," she said. The phone was still in her hand when Damien crossed the table in 2 steps and took it from her. Not rough, not gentle either. Just fast, the motion of someone who understood that the next 30 seconds mattered more than anything that had happened in the last 2 hours. He put the phone to his own ear and listened, and his face did something she hadn't seen it do before. Went very flat, the way a face goes when the person behind it is running calculations at a speed that doesn't leave room for expression. He lowered the phone, looked at Marcus, said, "They have the boy." Marcus was already moving. He had a second phone out and was dialing before Damien finished the sentence, crossing to the far side of the room with his back turned and his voice low and fast. Lena stood up. "That was Cassie's location. How did he—" "I don't know yet." "You said it was somewhere he didn't know about." "It was." Damien set her phone on the table and pulled his own and dialed. He held it to his ear and waited, and the waiting was the worst thing she'd watched him do yet, because he was not a man who waited easily, and the fact that the call wasn't being answered immediately meant something was wrong on the other end. It rang 6 times, 7. Then Cassie's voice, compressed and tight. "We're compromised. I've got Eli. We're mobile, but they came to the house. 3 of them. We got out the back." A breath, something that wasn't quite a gasp. "They knew the address, Damien. They knew which room." Damien said, "Where are you now?" "Moving, north on Callahan. I don't have a tail, but I'm not sure." Her voice dropped. "He's scared. Eli. He's holding it together, but he's scared." "Keep moving. Don't stop anywhere, Lit. Call me in 8 minutes." He ended the call. Lena was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before either. Not panic. She wasn't a woman who panicked, but something underneath the composure that was close to fracturing. The specific look of a person who has been holding a structure together with their bare hands for a very long time and has just felt the first piece give way. "They knew the address," she said. "Yes." "Nobody knew that address except you and whoever you told." He was quiet for a second. "Yes." She let that sit between them. She watched him process it, watched his face stay controlled while something moved behind it. Then she said, "How many people did you tell?" 3. He said it the way a person says something they've already done the math on and don't like the answer. Marcus, Cassie, and one other. She looked at Marcus, who had turned around from his call and was watching Damien with an expression that was carefully, professionally neutral. Not me, Marcus said. He said it without heat, just clear. Damien said, I know. Marcus said, then we have a problem. The third name sat in the room without being said for a moment. Then Damien picked up his phone again and made another call, and this one went to voicemail immediately. Not a ring, straight to voicemail. And he stood there with the phone at his side and stared at the far wall. Trent, he said, to no one in particular, or to himself, or to the version of himself that had trusted the wrong person. Lena said, Who is Trent? Damien didn't answer right away. He set the phone on the table and pressed both hands flat against the surface and looked at the document spread across it, and she could see the muscles in his jaw working, the specific physical tell of a man absorbing something he hadn't seen coming. He's been with me for 9 years, Damien said. She waited. He's the one who ran the initial trace on your number. On you. He paused. He's the one who told me Holloway's operation was routine, domestic, that it was a local situation that wouldn't complicate anything broader. Another pause. He kept telling me that. She understood. He was managing what you knew. Damien looked at her. He nodded, once, slow. For how long? She said. I don't know yet. Long enough to know Cassie's location. Long enough to feed Holloway information about what I was doing. He straightened up from the table. He wasn't visibly angry, and this was more frightening than if he had been, because what she saw instead was the cold, complete reorganization of a man who has just had the floor pulled out and is already deciding how to stand on what's left. Long enough that everything I thought I knew about the shape of this situation is in question. Marcus said, We need to move. If Trent's feeding Holloway information, this location is compromised too. Damien looked at Lena. Can you move? I've been moving for 3 years, she said. I'm fine. He took the documents off the table and fed them into a small shredder under the desk, quickly, without ceremony. Marcus closed the laptops and stacked them. The whole operation of clearing the room took less than 4 minutes, and she watched them work with the efficiency of people who had done this before, who had a version of this moment already built into their operating procedure because they lived in a world where being found was always a possibility. She picked up her phone from the table. There were no more calls or texts on it, just the dead air of the call that had ended with Eli's voice saying her name. She stared at the screen for a moment and then put it in her pocket and followed Damien out the back. Tote. Cassie met them in the parking structure of a shopping center that had been half closed for 2 years, its anchor stores gutted, and its upper levels unused. She pulled in with a green compact car that Lena didn't recognize, not the vehicle she'd been driving when she picked up Eli, which meant she'd switched during the run, which meant she'd been prepared for exactly this kind of contingency. Eli was in the back seat. Lena opened the rear door before the car fully stopped, and he looked at her with the expression she'd been most afraid of. Not accusation, not anger, just the face of someone who had trusted his sister's word and then found himself running out the back of a house while strangers shouted instructions at him. He was 19 and he was scared and he was trying not to show it, and the combination was devastating in the specific way that only a person who loves someone and has failed to protect them can fully feel. She got in the seat beside him. He didn't say anything. She put her hand on his arm and felt him exhale slowly, and they sat like that for a moment while Cassie got out of the car and went to Damien and Marcus, and the three of them stood 10 feet away talking in low, rapid voices. I had my headphones in, Eli said finally. The woman, Cassie, she just came in and said we had to go, and I didn't bring my charger. We'll get you a charger. That's not the point. I know. He looked out the window at the concrete columns of the parking structure and the darkness beyond them. Is this Grant? Yes. Is he going to find us again? She looked at her brother's profile, at the jaw that was their mother's and the forehead that was nobody's but his own, and the particular way he held still when he was frightened, rigid, like stillness was armor. No, she said. She didn't know if it was true. She said it anyway. Damien had a second property. She learned this the way she was learning most things about him, not through explanation, but through the fact of it materializing in front of her. A house in the Delphi neighborhood, outer edge of the city, older construction, the kind of house with thick walls and a back entrance and neighbors who were far enough away that the distance was itself a form of privacy. He drove them there himself. Cassie followed in the green car with Marcus. Nobody spoke much during the drive. 18 minutes on surface streets that Damien navigated without GPS from memory, taking turns that she was fairly sure were not the most direct route and that served some security purpose she didn't ask about. The house was dark when they arrived. He unlocked the front door and reached in without entering and turned on a single lamp in the entry, and she thought about what it said about a person that this was how they moved through a space, checking it with light before committing to it. He set Eli up in a back room with the charger Cassie produced from a bag in the car and a sandwich from somewhere, and the quiet, specific courtesy of someone who understood that this young man needed to not be talked at right now. Eli took the sandwich and the charger and said, "Thanks," to the room in general, and Cassie said, "I'll be right outside," in a tone that managed to be both watchful and unobtrusive, and the door closed. In the front room, Damien spread his operational materials across a wooden table that had probably been a dining table at some point and was now whatever he needed it to be. Lena stood across from him. Marcus sat in the corner with a laptop and the expression of someone running a thread he expected to be unpleasant. "Tell me about Trent," she said. Damien looked up. "What do you want to know?" "Everything that connects him to Holloway. Everything that connects him to you. Whatever the shape of this is." He was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant, just precise, the way he was always precise, assembling the right version of the answer before delivering it. "Trent Adler. I pulled him from a financial fraud operation about 9 years ago. He had skills I needed. He could read money structures, follow laundering trails, map the relationships between shell companies and legitimate business in a way that took most analysts twice as long." He paused. "He knew about Holloway's network before I did. In retrospect, he's been its intelligence asset inside my operation for, I don't know how long, at least a year, possibly longer." She absorbed this. "He told you Holloway was small time. He told me Holloway was domestic, not worth a significant commitment of resources." His voice was flat, but she was beginning to read the flatness, the way it got slightly more controlled when what it was covering was more significant. "He was managing my perception, keeping me from seeing how large the financial network actually was, probably because a real investigation would eventually surface the connection to whoever Holloway is actually working for." She caught the phrasing, "whoever he's working for. Holloway isn't at the top. The money structure is too organized for a local operator. He's a regional manager. The network above him is what Trent's been protecting." He looked at her. "We don't know who that is yet." She sat down. The chair was wooden and straight-backed, and she was very tired, and she sat in it anyway and looked at the documents on the table and thought about the architecture of what she'd been living inside for 3 years. She'd thought it was one man with a temper and a blackmail operation and enough local corruption to protect himself. She'd thought, in her worst moments, that the reason nothing could be done was because Grant Holloway was smart and connected and cruel, and the system around him was compromised. She hadn't understood that the system wasn't just compromised, it was built that way. It was load-bearing. "My mother," she said. Damien looked at her. She found the household accounts. She found discrepancies. She kept her voice even. She was getting better at it, or she was getting worse at feeling things, and she wasn't sure which one this was. She would have kept looking. She was that kind of person. A pause. She would have found the shape of it. Probably yes. So she was killed because she was close to the center, not because she was a problem for Holloway specifically, because she was a problem for whatever is above Holloway. Damien was quiet for a moment. "That's my read." She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about 4 years of a death that had never felt right, of a grief that had an edge to it she'd never been able to name because she hadn't had the right shape for it. Now she had the shape. It was bigger than she'd imagined, and it was older, and it had been operating without interruption the whole time. "Okay," she said. Marcus looked up from the corner. Damien said, "Okay." "What's—" Marcus looked up from the corner. Damien said, "Okay. What's the next move?" "I need to find Trent before Holloway knows we've identified him. If Trent goes to ground, he takes everything he knows with him." He looked at Marcus. "Where is he?" Marcus said, "Last cell ping puts him in the Haverstock district, 40 minutes ago. He's moving, but not fast." A pause. "He might not know we know yet." "Or he wants us to think that," Cassie said from the hallway. She'd come back from the back room, quiet in the way of someone used to moving through spaces without announcing herself. She leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed. "If I were Trent, and I'd just blown my cover by tipping Holloway to Eli's location, I'd be deciding right now whether to run or whether to come in with a story." Damien said, "He won't run. He has too much here. Family, history." He said this the way a man says something about someone he's known for 9 years, with the particular tone of an assessment that costs something to make. "He'll come in with a story." "Then we need to be ready for the story," Cassie said. "I want to be there when you talk to him," Lena said. The room went quiet in a specific way. She felt it, the slight recalibration of 3 people who hadn't been planning for her to say that. Damien said, "That's not—" "He fed information about my brother to people who sent men to grab me off the street. He's been protecting the people who arranged my mother's death." She looked at Damien steadily. "I'm not asking to be in charge of it. I'm telling you I'm going to be in the room." A pause. Cassie and Marcus exchanged a look that was so brief it was barely a look at all. Damien said, "You'll listen. You won't speak until I tell you it's okay to speak." "Agreed." Shout. Trent Adler came in at 11:40. He didn't call ahead. He just appeared at the door of the Delphi house with his key. He had a key, she noted, which meant this location wasn't as secure as she'd believed, and let himself into the entry and stopped when he saw Damien sitting at the table in the front room with the lamp on, and Marcus against the wall and Lena in the straight-back chair in the corner. He was in his mid-40s, medium build, with the kind of unremarkable face that was different from Marcus's forgettable face in a specific way. Marcus's face forgot itself. Trent's face was practiced at being read as harmless. She saw it immediately. The calibration of his expression when he walked in, the microsecond of assessment before the face arranged itself into something that looked like surprise and concern. She thought, "He's been doing this for a long time." He said, "Damien, I heard about Cassie's location. I've been trying to—" He looked at Lena, back at Damien. "Who is this?" Damien said, "Sit down, Trent. I need to brief you on—" "Sit down." Something passed through Trent's face, there and gone. He sat in the chair across the table from Damien and put his hands flat on the surface in the manner of a man demonstrating that he had nothing to hide, and she thought about how specific that gesture was, how chosen. Damien said, "Walk me through your day." Trent said, "I've been trying to reach you for 3 hours. After I heard about the breach at Cassie's location, I started running traces on how Holloway could have—" "Where were you at 2 o'clock this afternoon?" A beat. "My office, working the financial trace on the Holloway network, same as yesterday. Alone. Marcus was in and out." Marcus said, from the wall, "I wasn't there at 2. Trent looked at Marcus. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. The very slight adjustment of a man recalculating. "I may have the time wrong," he said. "The time isn't wrong," Damien said. "At 2:07 this afternoon, a call was placed from your secondary cell to a number that connects to Holloway's operation through 2 intermediaries. The call lasted 4 minutes. He paused. "The address of Cassie's safe house was passed in that call." Silence. Trent looked at Damien. His face had not broken. She had to give him that. He was genuinely controlled. But the performance had shifted slightly, the way a building shifts before it comes down. The harmless arrangement of his features was still there, but underneath it something was making a decision. He said, "You've been running surveillance on your own people." "Tell me about the call, Trent." "You've been—" "Tell me about the call." Another beat. Longer. Then Trent sat back in his chair and folded his hands on the table with a deliberateness that was its own kind of admission, the gesture of a man who has decided to stop spending energy on a performance and start spending it on the next available option. "How long have you known?" he said. "Since this morning," Damien said. "Fully. Pieces of it longer." Trent nodded slowly. He looked at the table. He looked at Lena. Properly this time, not the dismissive assessment of before, but with something that was almost evaluation. "The nurse," he said. She said nothing. "She's what changed your timeline," Trent said to Damien. "You were going to sit on Holloway's network for another month, move piece by piece. Then she sent you a message, and you—" He stopped. Something shifted on his face that was, improbably, close to something real. Not remorse, but something that sat in the same neighborhood. "I tried to slow you down. I told you it was small time. I kept the picture small." "How long?" Damien said. Trent was quiet. "How long, Trent?" 14 months. The number landed in the room. 14 months. She did the math without meaning to. 14 months ago, she'd still been trying to believe that the situation at home was something she could manage. 14 months ago, she'd filed the second police report that had gone nowhere. 14 months ago, Trent Adler had been feeding information about his own employer's operations to the network that employed Grant Holloway, and Grant Holloway had been using that information to stay ahead of anything that might dismantle what he'd built. She thought about her mother. She thought about the timeline. She thought about whether 14 months extended back far enough to touch events she already knew the shape of. She said, "My mother." Trent looked at her. Damien looked at her. She'd agreed to stay quiet. She'd broken that agreement, and she didn't much care. She said, "Did you know about my mother?" Trent held her gaze. He was not a man who looked away, she noted. Whatever he wasn't a coward about being looked at. He said, "I knew there had been an arrangement, after the fact." She said, "And you said nothing." "I was 14 months into something I couldn't walk away from." "She was 14 months dead," Lena said, and her voice was very quiet and very specific. The voice of someone who has found the exact temperature of an emotion and is using it like an instrument rather than losing it. "She was 14 months dead when you started. It predates you. But you found out, and you stayed in, and you said nothing." Trent didn't answer. There was nothing available to him that would have served any purpose. Damien said, "Who is above Holloway?" Trent looked at him. "You've been protecting something. The financial structure is too organized for Holloway to have built. There's a network above him, and you know who runs it." Trent said, "If I tell you that, I'm dead. You're already in a complicated position. There's a difference between complicated and dead. Tell me who runs it." Trent looked at the table. He looked at his own hands. He was running the calculation. She could see it. What he had, what he could trade, what it was worth, what it would cost. This was the thinking of a man who had been doing this for 14 months and had developed fluency in the mathematics of leverage. He said, "I need something in return." Damien said, "You need to tell me what you know and let me decide what it's worth." "That's not Trent." Damien's voice dropped a register. Not louder, quieter. The specific quiet of someone who doesn't need volume because they have everything else. "You told Holloway where a 19-year-old boy was sleeping. You gave him information that led men to try to pull a woman off a street. You have been protecting a network that killed her mother and has destroyed the lives of however many families I haven't even begun to count." He paused. "You don't negotiate with me right now. You tell me what you know, and I decide what happens next." The room was very still. Trent Adler looked at Damien Vescari across the table in the lamplight, and she watched something in the older dynamic between them. 9 years of it, whatever it had contained, conclude itself. He said, "The man above Holloway is named Carver. I don't have a first name. I have an account number and a routing address and a physical description and 2 meetings I attended where he was present." He paused. "He's not local. He operates across 3 regions. Holloway is one of 6 regional managers." Damien said, "Where does he operate from?" "Different locations, but there's a central processing point, a property used to manage the financial transfers, the physical records, the communications." He looked at the table. "It's not in this city." Damien said, "Where?" Trent said, "About 90 miles southeast, small county. The property looks like a logistics company." He looked up. "That's where the encryption keys are. Not at Holloway's county property. That was a secondary location. He moved the core record 6 months ago when he started feeling pressure." She felt Damien absorb this. She felt the recalibration happening in real time. 9 days of intelligence, carefully built, Partially correct. Now restructured around a new center of gravity that was 90 miles away and ran deeper than anyone had mapped. Marcus said from the wall, "That explains why the county property came back clean on the financial sweep. We were looking at the satellite." Damien didn't respond to Marcus. He was looking at Trent. He said, "You'll take us to the property." Trent said, "I told you what I know." "You'll take us there. You'll tell us what you remember about the layout, the security, the personnel, and then you'll stay where I put you until this is resolved." He paused. "That's the deal." Trent looked at him for a long moment. "And after it's resolved?" Damien said, "We'll have that conversation after." It wasn't a promise. She noticed that he didn't make it one. Trent noticed too, and she could see that he recognized what it was. The most honest thing available in the present circumstances. And that he was going to take it because the alternatives were worse. "All right," Trent said. The word fell flat in the room. A door closed somewhere in the back of the house. Eli, probably, moving around. The ordinary human sounds of a young man in an unfamiliar space trying to settle. The lamp flickered once from a bad connection and held. Lena sat in the straight-back chair in the corner and looked at Damien, who was looking at Trent, and she thought, "Everything we built our approach on was the wrong map. We were looking at the wrong location. We were looking at the wrong man. The person I've been living inside for 3 years isn't the architect of this. He's a piece of it, a regional piece. And the thing that made my mother's death possible and necessary is 90 miles away in a building that looks like a logistics company." She thought, "Holloway still doesn't know we've identified Trent as the source of the breach. He thinks he scored a win tonight. He knows where Eli was. He sent men to that location. And what he doesn't know is that Eli got out and that his intelligence asset is currently sitting in a house telling us where the real center of the operation is." She thought, "We have a window, narrow, closing, but real." She stood up from the chair. Everyone in the room looked at her. She said to Damien, "He doesn't know Trent's been turned. He thinks tonight was a win. He'll expect things to go quiet while we regroup." She paused. "He won't expect us to move toward the center." Damien said, "That's correct." "So we move before he knows to prepare for it." Damien looked at her. That flat, dense, assessing look she'd been learning to read for the better part of 2 weeks. She could see him weighing it. The risk of moving fast against the risk of losing the window. The risk of taking her into this against the risk of what happened if she wasn't in it. "You said you remember the property," he said. "The county location Holloway showed you." I said I remembered what I could see from outside the outbuilding. "And the logistics property, 90 miles southeast." He looked at Trent. "She'll need a briefing on the layout." Trent looked at Lena with an expression that was complicated in ways she wasn't going to spend time untangling. Then he said, "There are 2 entry points. The front is manned around the clock. The eastern loading dock has a 6-hour rotation. Shortest window is between 3 and 4 a.m. He paused. "The server room is in the basement. The encryption keys are on a physical drive in a lockbox that requires both a code and a biometric." Lena said, "Who's biometric?" Trent said, "Holloway's." She looked at Damien. He was already looking at her. "Then we need Holloway," she said. The room was quiet for a moment with the weight of what that meant. Not just bringing Holloway in, not just outsmarting him, but getting close enough to use him, to put his hand on a lock, to extract from him the one thing he'd built to be irreplaceable without either killing him or losing the evidence. Cassie said from the doorway, very quietly, "That's not a plan. That's a trap." "Yes," Lena said, "it is." But she looked at Damien and he looked back at her. And in the silence between them, the thing that had been building for 2 weeks, the careful distance, the professional boundary of someone who helped and someone who was being helped, shifted into something else entirely, something that was less comfortable and more real, the particular gravity that forms between 2 people who are standing in the same fire and have just decided to stop pretending they're not. "He still thinks I'm the variable," she said. "He still thinks I'm the thing he can use to control the situation." She paused. "Let him." Damien said, "If it goes wrong—" "I have been the thing that goes wrong in Grant Holloway's world for 3 years," she said, "and I am still here." Her voice was flat and clear and did not shake. "Let him think he has me. Let him come to where I am. And when he does, I'll get you into that building." Outside, the rain had stopped at some point during the last hour without anyone noticing. The silence it left behind was the loudest thing in the room. Damien looked at her for a long moment. She held it. She did not look away, and she did not qualify what she'd said, and she did not offer him an easier version of it. Then he said, "Tell me exactly what you have in mind." And she began to talk. And as she talked, the plan assembled itself from pieces she hadn't known she'd been collecting for 3 years. Every detail she'd memorized because it might keep her alive. Every pattern she'd observed because observing was how she'd survived. Every map she'd drawn in her head of the world she'd been trapped inside. And she felt for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember that the fear she had been carrying was not gone, but was changing shape, was becoming something she could aim. The lamp burned steady in the front room of the Delphi house, and Trent Adler sat across the table with the look of a man watching something he hadn't accounted for. And Marcus wrote everything down, and Cassie stood in the doorway with an expression that had shifted from skepticism to something closer to assessment, and Damien Vescari listened to Lena Ashford with the complete, unbroken attention of a man who had stopped underestimating her. At some point he couldn't precisely identify, and wasn't going to make that mistake again. In the back room, Eli had his headphones on, and from somewhere down the hall the faint sound of music leaked through. Something with a beat, something alive. And it was the most ordinary sound in the world, and it was the thing she was doing all of it for. And she did not let herself look toward it, because if she did, she would lose the edge she needed, and she needed every edge she had. What none of them knew yet, what was assembling itself in a room 90 miles southeast, in a building that looked like a logistics company, where a man named Carver was receiving reports from a source that was not Trent Adler, had never been only Trent Adler, was that the window they thought they had was already being measured from the other side. The plan had 3 parts and 0 margin for error, which meant it was the kind of plan that worked perfectly or destroyed everything, with nothing in between. Damien said this out loud, at 2 a.m, standing at the table in the Delphi house, with the documents spread in front of him and Lena across from him and Marcus and Cassie on either side. He said it without apology, without softening. He said it because she deserved the accurate version. She said, "I know." He said, "If Holloway doesn't take the bait, he'll take it. You can't know that." "I know him," she said. "I've been studying him for 3 years the way you study something dangerous that you can't run from. I know what he responds to. I know what makes him feel in control." She paused. "He responds to vulnerability. He feels in control when he thinks someone's alone and scared and has nowhere to go." She held Damien's gaze. "So I'll be alone and scared and have nowhere to go. And he'll come." Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the table. Then he said, "Walk me through it again." She walked him through it again. Part 1. Lena makes contact with Holloway directly. Not through intermediaries, not through the apartment. A direct call to his personal cell. The number she had memorized because she'd dialed it 100 times over 3 years, asking if he'd be home for dinner, asking if it was safe to bring Eli somewhere. She would tell him she'd gotten away from the people watching her. She would sound frightened. This would not require acting. She would tell him she wanted to come back, that she had nowhere else. Part 2. Holloway, believing his intelligence through Trent was still intact and not knowing Trent had been turned, would set a meet. Not the apartment. Too exposed now. Too many unknowns. He'd take her to the logistics property. She was certain of this because it was where he kept his leverage, and his leverage was what made him feel safe. And when Holloway felt threatened, he went toward his leverage. Part 3. Inside the property, with Holloway's biometric and his override code, which Trent had provided, which unlocked the lockbox if Holloway was physically present to provide the second factor, they would extract the encrypted files, pull the decryption key, and transmit everything to the federal contact Damien had been cultivating for 6 months. The kind of federal contact who had the authority to move on it. Cassie said, "The window at the loading dock is 3 to 4 a.m. If the meet takes longer than..." "It won't," Lena said. "I'll move it. I'll push it." Marcus said, "And if there are more people inside the property than Trent briefed us on?" Trent, from the corner where he'd been sitting in silence for the last hour, said, "There are usually 4 personnel on the overnight. 2 on the front gate, 1 in the monitoring room, 1 walking the interior. He paused. If Carver is there, is Carver likely to be there? Damien said. Trent said, I don't know. I haven't been able to reach anyone in the last 6 hours. He paused. That's either because they've gone dark or because I'm already burned on their end. If you're burned, Marcus said, this whole approach is compromised before it starts. If I'm burned, Trent said, they'd have moved on us already. The fact that we're sitting here suggests I have some hours left before they figure out which side I landed on. The room absorbed this. Then Damien said, we move at 3:30. Nobody argued. Lena made the call at 2:47 from a burner Cassie produced from the same bag that had contained the charger and the sandwich. She sat in the front room alone. Damien had offered to stay, but she'd shaken her head because she needed to be a woman calling the man who had controlled her life for 3 years with nothing in the room to hold on to except her own voice, and having someone there would make her reach for them instead. She dialed. It rang 4 times. She counted each one. He picked up on the 5th ring, and his voice was the voice she'd been living with for years. Measured, with that underneath current of assessment, always measuring, always calibrating what he was being told against what was useful to him. Lena, I need help. She let her voice be what it was. Not performed fear, not manufactured trembling, just the truth of a woman who was in the middle of something dangerous and knew it. I got away from them. The people whoever was watching the building, I got away. I've been moving for hours and I don't... She stopped, breathed, let the breath be audible. I don't know where Eli is. I don't know if he's okay. A pause. She heard him thinking. She'd heard that pause 1,000 times. It was the sound of Grant Holloway deciding whether something was useful. Where are you now? He said. I don't know. I've been walking. A parking lot somewhere? It's near a warehouse district, I think. She'd chosen this deliberately. Vague, geographical, frightened, consistent with someone who'd been running scared for hours. Are you hurt? No, I'm scared. Another pause, then, I can come get you. I need you to stay where you are. Turn on your location. I dropped my phone. This is someone's phone they let me borrow. I just need... She pushed a specific kind of unsteadiness into her voice, the specific tremor of someone who has been holding it together for hours and is now very close to the edge. I need you to tell me Eli's okay. I need to know you have him. She held her breath. Holloway said, Eli's fine. He's safe. The smoothness of the lie, the particular warmth he could manufacture, had never stopped being impressive in its wrongness. I'm going to come get you. I need you to tell me anything you can about where you are. She gave him the industrial district. She gave him the detail about the loading dock signs she'd noticed. She let him triangulate while she talked, because she needed him driving toward a place she could move from, not toward a fixed point she couldn't control. I'll be there in 40 minutes, he said. Stay out of sight. Okay? Lena. His voice dropped to the specific register he used when he wanted to sound like a person who cared about her. I'm glad you called me. You did the right thing. She didn't answer. She ended the call. She sat in the front room for a moment with the burner in her hands. Then she stood up, put it in her jacket pocket, and walked to the doorway where Damien was standing with his shoulder against the frame, not pretending he hadn't been listening through the wall. She said, 40 minutes. He straightened, turned, said, let's go. The logistics property sat at the end of a county road that had no reason to be taken at 3 a.m. by anyone without a destination. From the satellite image, she'd memorized it, but the actual ground was different from the image the way real things are always different. The tree line was thicker on the south side, the access road had a curve that didn't show at that resolution, and the lights around the building's perimeter were brighter and more numerous than she'd expected. The kind of lighting that said the people inside weren't worried about drawing attention from the county road because there was nobody on the county road to notice. Damien's vehicle, different from the SUV, a nondescript work van Marcus had sourced from somewhere that asked no questions, came off the county road 2 miles before the property and went across a service track that Trent had described, and that was exactly where Trent had said it was, which was the first thing all night that had gone exactly as planned, and she noted it with the specific appreciation of someone who understood how rare that was. Marcus was driving. Cassie was in the rear with the equipment. Communications gear, the portable transmission unit that would uplink the files to Damien's federal contact the moment they were extracted. Trent was in the rear too, secured with a zip tie to the van's interior frame, which had been his suggestion rather than theirs. He'd said, "If there's any chance I'm already burned on their end and they're watching for me, I shouldn't be mobile." She'd respected the logic of it. She wasn't sure what else she respected about Trent Adler, but that she respected. Damien was in the passenger seat. She was behind him, watching the tree line pass in the dark and counting seconds. She said, "Holloway's 40 minutes starts from when I ended the call. That was 22 minutes ago," Damien said. "We have time. And if he comes faster than 40 minutes, then we have less time." He turned and looked at her. "You've been running contingencies in your head for 20 minutes. Stop." You're doing the thing people do when they've been controlling their fear by over-preparing," he said. "And over-preparing past a certain point is just fear with extra steps." He held her gaze. "You know this building. You know this man. You have done things in the last 2 weeks that most people would not have done. Stop running the math and trust what you've built." She looked at him. Something in her chest made a sound it didn't actually make. She said, "You're very sure of yourself for someone walking into a building full of people who would rather we weren't there." He said, "I'm not sure of myself. I'm sure of the plan." A pause. "There's a difference." Marcus brought the van to a stop in the tree line 200 meters east of the loading dock. They could see the dock from here. The overhead lights, the metal door, the single camera mounted above it angled to cover the approach from the access road rather than the east side, which was the detail Trent had given them, and which was confirmed by what she could see from the van. Damien checked his watch, said to Marcus, "We're going in at 3:08. You hold the vehicle here, engine warm, and you do not move until you hear from me or Cassie. If you haven't heard by 4:15, I know," Marcus said. "I need to hear you say it." Marcus said, "I pull out and I call the federal contact directly with whatever Cassie managed to upload before the situation changed." He paused. "I'm not going to need to do that." "No," Damien said. "You're not." She watched the dock. At 3:04, the door opened and a figure stepped out. The interior walker, making a circuit exactly as Trent had described. He moved along the side of the building with the particular rhythm of someone doing a job on autopilot at 3 in the morning, and she watched him and counted his pace and timed the return to the door. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. She noted this. She would not forget it. At 3:08, she and Damien and Cassie went. The loading dock door had a keypad. Trent had given them a code that was either current or wasn't, and there was no way to know until they used it. And she stood at Damien's shoulder in the shadow of the dock overhang while he punched in the 8 digits, and she held her breath, and the keypad beeped once and the lock disengaged. She breathed. Inside was dark and functional. Concrete floor, metal shelving stacked with inventory that was real inventory, actual product. The cover of a functioning business maintained with enough authenticity to pass external inspection. The smell was of packaging material and climate-controlled air, and something underneath that was the particular industrial scent of servers running in a basement. Cassie peeled left toward the monitoring room. Her job was the cameras, buying them time by looping the feeds, a process that required physical access to the monitoring terminal and that she had approximately 90 seconds to complete before the walker returned and resumed interior circulation. Lena and Damien went straight. She navigated by the memory of Trent's description, confirmed at each junction by the reality matching what he'd told her, each match a small exhale of relief she didn't allow herself to fully feel because they were still inside and still moving and relief cost attention. The stairwell to the basement was where he said it was. The door was unlocked, which meant the basement was considered internal-only secure, which meant they had not yet tripped any alarm that prompted a lockdown. The server room was cold, the kind of institutional cold that server infrastructure requires, that bit through her jacket and made her hands unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Racks of equipment she didn't need to understand. LEDs in blue and green, the quiet, persistent hum of something processing continuously. Against the far wall, a workstation, and beside it, a gray metal lockbox mounted at desk height with a biometric reader and a numeric keypad. She said, "How long until Holloway arrives?" Damien checked his watch. 12 minutes, maybe less. He looked at the lockbox. "We need him here." "I know." She pulled out the burner. "I'll call him now. Tell him I'm inside the building, that someone brought me here, that I'm scared." She paused. "He'll come in. He'll come in with people. Then you need to be ready for people." He looked at her. He said, "I don't love this part." "I know," she said. "Do it anyway." She made the call. Holloway picked up in one ring. He was close. She could hear it in the quality of the connection, the way nearby cells pick up differently. She talked fast, convincingly, painting the picture of a woman who'd been brought somewhere by the people he was looking for, who'd slipped away from them inside a building, who was hiding and needed him to come in through the loading dock. She gave him the dock code, Trent's code, the same one they'd used. She ended the call, looked at Damien, said, 7 minutes. He moved, back toward the base of the stairs to the position they'd identified from Trent's briefing, a structural column that created a blind spot from the stairwell entrance wide enough for 2 people to stand behind if they stood close. She followed, and they stood there in the cold server room hum, and she could feel the warmth of him beside her and the specific quality of his stillness that she'd been reading for 2 weeks, that she could now read well enough to know he was running the same controlled adrenaline management she was, the deliberate breathing, the conservation of energy. She said quietly, "If this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, Eli has the address of this place on a piece of paper in his jacket pocket." She'd done this before they left the Delphi house, written it in her own handwriting, told him to give it to Priya at Mercy General if he didn't hear from her by morning. "He knows what to do with it." Damien was quiet for a moment. Then he said, just as quiet, "Nothing is going to happen to you." She said, "You can't know that." He said, "No." A pause. "But I'm going to operate as if I do." She almost said something. She didn't. The moment wasn't the right one, and she filed it in the place where she'd been filing things about Damien Vescari for 2 weeks. The things that weren't quite what she'd expected, that didn't map onto any category she already had for people. 4 minutes later, she heard the dock door. Holloway came in with 2 men. She'd expected this. Damien had expected this. She heard the 3 of them before she saw them. Footsteps on the concrete above, the specific rhythm of people moving with purpose, and then the stairwell door opening and the sound descending. She pressed against the column. Beside her, Damien was completely still. Holloway came down the stairs first. He was a man who led from the front in confined spaces because he understood that putting yourself behind your people read as weakness, and Holloway never read as weakness if he could help it. He came into the server room with his eyes moving, scanning, assessing, and she stepped out from behind the column. His eyes found her immediately. For 1 second, she saw his face without its performance, the genuine flicker of relief, the authentic satisfaction of a man who has been tracking something and found it. Then the performance came back up, the warmth, the controlled authority. "Lena?" He moved toward her. "Are you hurt?" She held her ground. She said, "I'm okay." He was 3 feet from her when he stopped. His 2 men fanned slightly behind him, not dramatically, just the professional positioning of people who were paid to be in the right place. She could see them in her peripheral vision. She did not look at them. "Who brought you here?" Holloway said. "I don't know their names. They had me in a van. I got out when they slowed down near the dock." She kept her voice the right kind of unsteady. Enough to read as frightened, not so much as to read as performing. "Grant, I need... It's okay." He took her arm. The grip was firm in the specific way his grips always were. Not hurting, just establishing that he was the one deciding how this went. "You're safe now. I'm going to get you out of here." She said, "Wait." He stopped. Something shifted slightly in his expression. She said, "I need you to open the lockbox." Complete stillness. 3 seconds. Then his face did something she had never seen it do. Not anger, not the usual management of expression. Genuine, unguarded surprise. "What?" he said. "The lockbox." She gestured at the wall. "I need you to open it." The two men behind him moved. Small movement, weight shift. The preparation of people who have been given a nonverbal signal she hadn't seen him give. She heard it, registered it, did not react to it. Holloway's grip on her arm tightened, not subtly. "Who are you working with?" "Open the lockbox, Grant." "Who brought you here?" "You did," she said. "I called you. I told you where I was. You came." She looked at him, and what was in her face was not the thing he was used to seeing there, was not the managed, careful expression of a woman working to keep things from escalating. It was something else, something she'd been building toward without knowing it, something that had been assembling in the stairwell of her apartment building and a hotel room with a textured ceiling and a parking structure in the rain. "I've been studying you for 3 years," she said. "You always go toward your leverage when you feel threatened. I knew you'd come here. I knew you'd bring the minimum you trusted." She looked past him briefly, just for a second. "That was a mistake." He turned. He was fast. She'd always known he was fast. But Damien was already there, out of the server row he'd moved into during the conversation, covering the distance to the nearer of the two men with an efficiency she felt in her chest, the sound of it short and definitive, and Cassie was at the base of the stairs from above, and the configuration of the room had changed in the time it took Holloway to turn. His grip on her arm was still there. He hadn't let go. He pulled her toward him in the specific way of a man who understood that the person he was holding was the most useful thing in the room, and she let herself be pulled because she'd planned for this too, this moment, the moment when he would use her as the last available piece of leverage. He put her in front of him and he said to the room, "Everybody stops." Damien stopped. He was standing over one of the men, who was on the floor with a reasonable amount of pain and no ability to do anything about it for the moment. Cassie was on the stairs. Holloway said, "Viscari." The name said on its own, with the particular flat acknowledgement of one operator identifying another. "I know who you are." Damien said nothing. "You've been moving against my operation for 3 weeks," Holloway said. "I know about the financial traces. I know about the contacts you compromised." His arm was across Lena's collarbone, not her throat, not quite. The specific positioning of someone who knew exactly how much pressure was useful and where. "Trent told me more than you think he told you." Lena said, "Did Trent tell you about Carver?" She felt him go still. The particular stillness of a man who has been hit somewhere he didn't expect. She said, "We know about the network. We know where the real center is. We know who's above you." She kept her voice steady in the cold server room, the hum of the machines continuous around them. "We have Trent, and we have everything Trent knows." She paused. "And none of it matters right now, because the only thing that opens that lockbox is your hand and your code. And the only thing that gets you out of this building is making a decision about whether you want to be the man who helped us or the man who didn't." Holloway breathed against the back of her head. She felt his chest moving, the rhythm of a man who is doing his own calculation. He said, "If I open it, I'm finished." She said, "If you don't, you're finished in a worse way." Carver is 90 miles away, and by the time he knows what happened here, it's going to be too late for Carver, too. She felt his grip tighten for 1 second, and then, just barely, just the fraction of a shift, loosen. Not release, but loosen. "Grant!" She said his name without the fear that had always been in it when she said it, and she felt him register the absence of it. "It's over. The only question is what you do next." A sound from the stairwell, movement, more than one person, the particular sound of people arriving with purpose, and she felt Holloway react to it, felt his body torque toward it. Damien said, "Federal agents, I called them 40 minutes ago." He said it the way he said things, not as a threat, not triumphantly, just as information, the accurate version. She felt Holloway's breathing change. She said, very quietly, just to him, "My mother knew too much. You made a call and she died in a bed in a private facility while I sat in the waiting room and they told me it was her heart." She said it without heat, without the rage she could have put into it, because the rage was real but wasn't useful right now, and she had learned in 3 years of surviving Grant Holloway to put useful before satisfying. Open the lockbox. He held her for another 3 seconds. She counted them. The voices on the stairs were louder now. Damien hadn't moved. Cassie hadn't moved. The man on the floor hadn't moved. Then Holloway released her. She stepped away from him and turned and watched him walk to the lockbox on the wall and put his thumb on the reader and punch in the 8-digit code, and the lockbox opened with a soft mechanical click. Inside, a small black drive, half the size of her palm. She crossed the room and took it before he could reconsider, and she turned and put it in Damien's hand, and his fingers closed around it, and the sound from the stairs was now the sound of people in motion at the bottom of them, and Cassie said from above, "Federal. They're at the dock." Damien looked at Lena. She looked back at him. She was shaking slightly, she noticed, not from fear, or not only from fear, from the accumulated physical cost of the last 6 hours, and the last 3 years, and the thing that had just happened in a cold server room in a building that looked like a logistics company 90 miles outside the city where she lived. Her hands were steady enough. The rest of her was working through it. Damien held the drive and looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was unusual now, and she thought, whatever that is, it's real. And she filed it in the same place she'd been filing the other things. Above them, Grant Holloway sat on the floor of the server room with his back against the wall, and the particular expression of a man who has spent a decade building something impenetrable and has just watched it come apart in a conversation with the woman he'd underestimated most. The federal agents came down the stairs, and in the monitoring room above, the camera feeds that Cassie had looped were still running their false quiet, but it didn't matter anymore, because the real moment had already happened, and the drive was in Damien's hand, and somewhere in the files it contained was the name of every person in 4 states who had made a choice to build their security on other people's fear. And every one of those names was now approximately 30 minutes from becoming someone else's problem to solve. What none of them had accounted for, what announced itself in the form of Cassie's voice from the top of the stairs, sharp and clipped, saying Damien's name in a tone that meant something was wrong, was that the monitoring room wasn't empty. Cassie said his name once, and that was enough. Damien was already moving toward the stairs before she finished the single syllable, the drive in his jacket pocket, one hand finding Lena's arm, not grabbing, not steering, just a brief, firm point of contact that said, "Stay close, stay moving." And then they were on the stairs, and Cassie was backing down them with her eyes on the monitoring room doorway above, and her hand out in the flat palm gesture that meant stop without saying it. From inside the monitoring room, a voice, male, unhurried, with the particular cadence of someone who has decided that urgency is no longer useful to him. "You can come up," the voice said. "I'm not armed. I'm aware of how that sounds." Damien stopped 2 steps from the top. Lena was 1 step below him. She could see the monitoring room doorway from here. The spill of blue-white light from the screens, the edge of a chair, the corner of a desk. No visible weapon. No visible threat configuration. Cassie said quietly, "He was in there when I came up to loop the feeds. He let me do it." Damien said, "He let you." He said, and I'm quoting, "Go ahead. I'm not here for the cameras." Lena said, "Carver." Both of them looked at her. She said, "That's who's in there. That's Carver." She didn't know how she knew. She knew the way you know the shape of something you've been circling for weeks without seeing. The particular way the pieces fit when the center finally presented itself. Trent had said, "I don't have a first name." Physical description. 2 meetings. A man who moved between locations, who didn't fix himself to any single geography, who had built something that could survive the removal of any individual piece, including Holloway. A man who would know when his operation was compromised and would make a calculation about what the loss of it was worth. A man who would come to the site of the loss and wait. Damien went up the last 2 steps and through the monitoring room door, and she followed him. The man in the room was in his late 50s. That was the first thing. Older than she'd built him in her imagination, though she hadn't consciously been building him. He was sitting in the operator's chair in front of the looped camera feeds with his hands visible on the desk in front of him, exactly as promised. Medium build, gone slightly soft at the edges, The body of someone who had spent years making other people do the physical work, gray at the temples. A face that was, in the particular way of faces that had survived by being underestimated, utterly unremarkable. He looked at Damien first, then at Lena. And on Lena his gaze stayed, and there was something in it that was the most unsettling thing she'd encountered all night. Not hostility, not threat assessment, but recognition. "You're the nurse," he said. She said, "Yes." Grant said you were a variable he was managing. He tilted his head slightly, a bird-like precision. He consistently underestimated what managing you was going to cost. Damien said, "Carver." The man looked at him. "I don't use that name generally, but yes. You came here." "I did." "Why?" Carver was quiet for a moment. He looked at the screens, the looped feeds, showing empty corridors in their perpetual 3-second repeat, the fiction of a quiet building. Then he looked back at Damien. "Because I wanted to see who dismantled it," he said. 14 months of interference, 3 weeks of active pressure, and then tonight." He paused. "I wanted to see the people who were good enough to do this." Lena said, "You knew we were coming." "I suspected when Trent stopped being reachable. Trent's particular pattern of unreachability has 2 versions, voluntary dark and involuntary. The voluntary version involves a 12-hour gap before reemergence. The involuntary version is permanent." He looked at his hands on the desk. "When it passed 12 hours, I came." She was watching him very carefully. Something was wrong with this. Not wrong in the way of a trap. The federal agents were in the building now. She could hear them below. The organized sound of people executing an operation, but wrong in the way of something that didn't fit the shape she'd expected. She said, "You're not trying to get out?" Carver looked at her. "No." "You could have been gone before we arrived. If you knew we were coming." "Yes." He said it simply. "I could have." "So why are you sitting in a chair with your hands on a desk in a building that's currently being entered by federal agents?" He held her gaze, and there was something in his face that she worked to read and couldn't quite, that existed in the space between resignation and something else, something older. He said, "How old was your mother when she died?" The room went very still. She said, 51. He said, "I had a daughter. She would be 34 now." He said it the way people say things they've said to themselves many times in private and have never said out loud, with the strange flatness of something that has been worn smooth. She was in the system, the kind of system Holloway's network fed. She owed money she couldn't pay. She had exposure she couldn't afford. She made decisions that people make when they have no options. He paused. She died in a county facility when she was 26. The official reason was medical. The room was silent. Lena looked at him. She thought about her mother. She thought about 51 years old in a private facility and a death that had been arranged. And she thought about a man who had built a network that ran on exactly that mechanism, on finding people's exposure and using it. And she thought about what it meant that the man at the center of it was sitting in a chair telling her about a daughter. She said, "That's not, I don't." She stopped. She started again. "You built this. You built the thing that does exactly what happened to her." "Yes," he said. "And you think—" "I don't think anything," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I came here because I wanted to see the end of it, and the end of it is this room. And I would like to give you something before the people downstairs come up here and the process of what comes next begins." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, slowly and with full visibility, and produced a small folded paper and set it on the desk. Damien said, "Don't." "It's paper," Carver said. He looked at Damien steadily. "It's a name and an account number. The name is the person above me. I'm a regional coordinator. The network I run is one of 3. The name on that paper is the person who runs all 3. He paused. "I was never going to give this to law enforcement. I was always going to give it to whoever managed to get here, because whoever managed to get here earned it, and because the person whose name is on that paper had my daughter flagged when she started looking for me." He looked at his hands. "She was looking for me because I'd been absent for most of her life, and she wanted to find me. and the people above me decided she was a liability. The silence was complete. Lena crossed the room and picked up the paper. She unfolded it, looked at Damien, held it out to him. He took it, read it. His face did not change, but she felt the quality of his stillness shift. He said, "I know this name." Carver said, "Most people in our world do." Damien folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket with the drive. He looked at Carver for a long moment. Then he said, "The federal agents downstairs are going to come up here." "I know. You understand what you're walking into." "I've understood for a long time," Carver said. "I stayed because leaving wasn't actually an option I was going to take." He paused. "You build something like this, and eventually you understand that you built yourself into the center of it. There's nowhere outside it to go." He looked at Lena. "Your mother would have found the center if she'd had more time. She was close. I want you to know that she was close, and that she was looking because she was trying to protect you and your brother, not because she was afraid for herself." Lena stood in the monitoring room with the camera feeds looping their blue-white fiction, and she looked at this unremarkable man in his 50s, and she felt something shift in her chest that was not forgiveness and not rage and not grief in the form she'd been carrying it. It was the more complicated thing, the thing that exists when a story you've been living inside finally reveals its full shape, and the shape is larger and older and more tangled than you knew, and the people inside it are worse and more human than you imagined, and the only thing you can do with that is hold it and keep moving. She said, "I know." And she meant, I know she was close. And she meant, I know you're not asking for forgiveness. And she meant, I heard you. She turned and walked out of the monitoring room and down the stairs. The federal operation took most of the rest of the night. She sat on the concrete lip of the loading dock with her jacket pulled around her and watched the organized machinery of it, the agents moving with the particular purposeful efficiency of people who had been waiting for this specific moment and were now executing against months of preparation. Damien's contact was a woman named Reyes, mid-40s, with short hair and a face that conducted business without performance. She spoke to Damien for 11 minutes near the dock door, and at the end of it she looked at the drive in her hand and at the folded paper and at Damien, and she said something that Lena couldn't hear, and Damien nodded. Grant Holloway came out of the building in handcuffs at 4:19 in the morning. She watched him cross the dock. He saw her sitting there and he stopped. The agent beside him allowed it for a moment, the particular professional courtesy of someone who understood that there were things happening in this moment that were older than the operation. And he looked at her with an expression that she read fully, and that she was not going to describe to anyone because it belonged to the private archive of things she knew and didn't need to share. She didn't say anything. She held his gaze for the 3 seconds he was stopped, and then looked away first. Not because she was finished with him, but because she was done letting him determine the rhythm of their interactions. And looking away first was the simplest possible expression of that. He was walked to a vehicle. The door closed. She watched the vehicle's taillights until they were gone. Carver came out 12 minutes later without handcuffs. By arrangement, Damien had told Reyes what Carver was and what Carver had provided, and Reyes had made a rapid assessment that a cooperative surrender with documentation was worth the reduction in visible constraint. He walked out of the building and into a different vehicle and did not look at the dock where Lena was sitting, and she did not look at him, and that was all either of them needed from each other. Trent Adler, still in the van at the tree line, was collected by 2 agents at 4:40 and driven away separately. She didn't watch that one. At 5:03, with the sky beginning its first gray suggestion of dawn at the eastern edge of the field beyond the property, Damien sat down on the concrete lip of the loading dock beside her. They didn't speak for a while. This was, she'd learned, a thing he was capable of. Genuine silence. Not the silence of someone waiting for the right moment to say something, but the silence of someone who understood that sometimes nothing needed to be said, and that adding words to that kind of moment was a subtraction, not an addition. She sat with it and felt it for what it was. Finally, she said, "The name on the paper." He said, "I'll deal with it. Reyes has it. Reyes has a copy. The original process will take longer than what happened tonight. It's above the level of what can be moved quickly." He paused. "But it will move." She nodded. She believed him. She was aware that she had been believing him for 2 weeks with less evidence than she normally required for anything, and that this said something she was still working out. She said, "Carver's daughter." Damien said, "Yes." She was flagged because she was looking for him. Yes. He built a machine that runs on that, on finding people's vulnerability and using it, and the machine used the same mechanism on the person he... She stopped. "I'm not making a case for him." "I know you're not. I'm just saying that the shape of it is... It's not what I expected the shape to be." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It never is. The people at the center of these things are never They're never purely one thing. That doesn't change what they built or what it cost." He paused. "But it's accurate that it's not simple." She looked at the field. The gray at the horizon was deepening, the particular slow brightening that happened before the actual color came. She thought about her apartment on Renwick Street, the stairwell with the flickering fluorescent, the voice message she'd sent to the wrong number standing between the third and fourth floor with her back against the wall. She said, "I haven't been home in 4 days." Damien said, "The apartment isn't safe until..." "I know, I didn't mean the apartment." She paused. "I don't think I'm going back to the apartment." He looked at her. She said, "I've been in that apartment for 3 years. Everything I own is in it, and I want about 6 of those things. The rest of it is just the place where that happened." She kept her voice level, not because the feeling underneath wasn't real, but because the level voice was the right voice for saying this out loud for the first time. "I'll get Eli. We'll find somewhere else. Start from a different address." He said, "Okay. I know that's not complicated for you. I know you move addresses the way other people move furniture." "I do," he said. "I'm not like that. I've never been like that. I stayed because Eli needed stable and I needed Eli to be stable." She looked at the field. "But stable in a bad place isn't stability. I've been confused about that." Damien was looking at her with the expression she'd been learning to read, the one that was the most honest, the least performed, the one that appeared when he wasn't managing what his face was doing because something had bypassed the management. She filed it the way she'd been filing things. She said, "What happens to you now?" He said, "What do you mean?" "The operation, what you were doing before I sent you a voice message by accident." She looked at him. "You were managing something. You had a structure. Trent was a piece of it. What happens to all of that now?" He was quiet for longer than usual. "It changes." It was already changing. He said this with the specificity of someone describing a fact, not a feeling. "What I found in Holloway's network, what Trent was protecting, that's the kind of thing that makes a person look at what they've been building and ask whether the building is actually what they thought it was." He paused. "I've been asking that question for 3 weeks. And? And I don't have a complete answer yet." He looked at the field. "But the answer that's assembling itself involves fewer things I'd need to explain to someone if they asked directly." She held the implication of that and didn't press it. She'd found, over the last 2 weeks, that pressing Damien Viscari was less effective than leaving space, because he filled space with the actual thing, whereas pressure produced the managed version. She said, "I called Priya before we went into the building." He looked at her. "From Marcus's phone. I told her I was okay and that I'd explain eventually, and that if she didn't hear from me by morning to call the number I gave her." She paused. "She said she'd been waiting for me to call for 3 weeks. She said she knew something was wrong in the break room that day, and she'd been deciding every shift whether to say something." "Why didn't she?" "She said she was waiting for me to be ready." Lena looked at her hands. "I've been thinking about that, about the people who wait instead of pushing, about whether that's kindness or..." She stopped. "I think it was kindness. I think she understood that I needed to find my own way to the door." Damien said, "That's a specific kind of love." She looked at him. He said it plainly, without decoration, and she thought, yes, that's exactly what it is. And I haven't thought of it in those terms, and the fact that he has said something about him that I'm going to keep thinking about. She said, "Yes." The sky was lightening properly now. Not dawn yet, but the promise of it, the commitment. She could see the field clearly, dry grass, the remnant of a fence line along the far edge, the dark suggestion of trees beyond it. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was an industrial county field in the early morning after a night that had cost more than she'd budgeted for. She thought it was one of the more real things she'd ever seen. Marcus drove them back to the Delphi house. She slept in the passenger seat for 40 minutes, deep and dreamless, the first clean sleep she'd had in longer than she could precisely remember, and woke up as they pulled into the neighborhood with her cheek against the cold window and the morning gray and soft around them. Eli was awake. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his headphones around his neck and a cup of something hot and a look on his face that she'd seen before, the specific expression he wore when he'd been worried and was now performing not worried to save her the guilt of it. She sat down across from him and put her hands on the table. He said, "You okay?" She said, "Yeah." He looked at her for a moment with the particular directness he had. The thing that people who didn't know him sometimes called bluntness, and that was actually something more precise than that, a refusal to participate in fictions when a fact was available. He said, "Is it done?" She said, "Most of it." "Grant?" "He's in federal custody. He's not going to be a problem." She paused. "He's not going to be anything for a long time." Eli wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at the table. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom would have wanted to see that." She said, "I know." She would have been so angry, and then she would have laughed. You know how she did that, where she laughed when she was angry because she didn't know what else to do with it. Lena said, "Yeah." Her voice was different on that word. She let it be. "I know exactly how she did that." They sat in the kitchen of the Delphi house in the early morning and didn't say much for a while, and it was the most comfortable silence she'd been inside in 4 years. But Reyes called at 10 in the morning. Lena was in the back room, the one Eli had used, sitting on the edge of the bed with her shoes off, and the window light coming in through thin curtains. She picked up. Reyes said, "The drive is clean, files are intact, decryption is processing. We're going to need you to come in for a formal statement. Not today, we'll schedule it. But soon." Lena said, "Okay." "Ms. Ashford." A pause. Reyes had the manner of someone who chose pauses deliberately. "The material on that drive connects to open cases in 3 states. The people whose names appear in it have been operating without consequence for a significant period of time." She paused again. "What you did last night, I'm not going to tell you it was smart because it wasn't, in several specific operational ways, but I'm going to tell you that the outcome of it is going to matter to a large number of people who have no idea your name exists." Lena said, "My mother's death is in those files." "I know. We'll process it properly. I can't promise you what the evidentiary outcome of that specifically will be, but I can tell you it will be processed." A pause. "I'm sorry for what happened to her." Lena said, "Me too." She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hands and the window light shifting as a cloud moved through somewhere above her, and the room went briefly dim and then bright again. She thought about her mother. Not the death. She'd been thinking about the death for 4 years, and she was going to think about it differently now, and that work was going to take time and was going to be done in privacy. She thought about her mother alive, thought about the way she laughed when she was angry, thought about a woman who had looked at household accounts and found discrepancies and kept looking, not because she was brave in any performed sense, but because she was the kind of person who looked at things directly and couldn't stop once she started. She thought, "That's where I got it." She didn't cry. She filed it, the way she filed things, in the place where she kept the things that mattered enough to need more time than the present moment had. 3 months later, Lena Ashford walked back into Mercy General on a Tuesday morning in early spring, first shift, the light through the lobby windows, the particular pale gold of a season changing. Priya was at the nurse's station when she came in. She looked up and looked at Lena in the way she'd been looking at Lena for 3 weeks of the informal leave that Lena had needed and that Mercy General had granted without asking questions that would have required answers. A look that was warm and calibrated and professional, and underneath all of that, simply glad. She said, "Coffee's bad today. It was bad yesterday. I don't think the machine is going to recover." Lena hung her jacket on the hook behind the station. She said, "I'll make it worse." "Please," Priya said. I need the company and suffering. They went to the break room together, and Lena made the coffee worse, as promised, and they stood at the counter and drank it, and Priya didn't ask about any of it. Not because she didn't know there was a lot to ask about, but because she understood, as she had understood for 3 weeks in the break room watching Lena's face and choosing to wait, that the door would open when Lena opened it. Lena said, I'm going to tell you everything, not today, but soon. Priya said, I know. It's a lot. I can see that. Some of it is, it's hard to explain without it sounding like a thing that doesn't happen to people. Priya said, things that don't happen to people constantly. That's basically the whole job. She gestured at the hospital around them. People come in here with things that shouldn't happen to anyone. We take care of them anyway. That's the whole job. Lena looked at her coffee. She said, yeah. She said it the way you say something when it lands correctly in a place that needed it. She went back to work. She checked on a 6-year-old with a fever and a 9-year-old recovering from a broken arm, and a 4-year-old who was afraid of the machines and who she sat with for 20 minutes, just talking about nothing, about the stuffed animal he'd brought with him, about the color of the walls, about the window and what was outside it. She did her charts. She ate lunch in the break room. She was present, continuously, in the way the job required. Not numbed, not managed from a distance, but actually there, actually engaged with the specific and ordinary work of making sick children less frightened. It was, she understood, the same thing it had always been. The place where she could breathe. The thing that had been hers even when everything else wasn't. Eli started a program in the fall. Vocational training, technical track. The kind of structured learning that suited the way his mind worked. Concrete, sequential, hands-on. He had an apartment with a roommate his program had matched him with, a young man who also needed structure and who had, against probability, become something like a friend. He called Lena on Sundays. He asked about her week with the particular directness that was his and told her about his with the same. And she found that the calls were 20 minutes and felt complete, not like editing. He had laughed freely. She had noticed when it first happened, a Sunday call, something about his roommate and a badly assembled piece of furniture, and the sound of it had done something to her chest that she hadn't been prepared for, had needed a moment after the call ended to just hold, to let it be what it was. Their mother would have laughed first and cried second. Lena knew the order exactly. Trent Adler cooperated fully with the federal investigation. The cooperation was the kind that took months and required multiple sessions and produced documentation that extended the investigation's reach considerably beyond what the drive alone had provided. Lena read about this in the brief and careful updates that Reyes provided, and she held her opinion of Trent Adler in the complicated space where it belonged. Not forgiven, not condemned, occupying the specific moral category of someone who had done terrible things for wrong reasons and then done useful things for a mixture of reasons she would never fully know. Grant Holloway entered a guilty plea on 7 counts, the minimum that the federal prosecution had been willing to accept, and that his attorneys had negotiated with the kind of effort that suggested they understood what the alternative looked like. He was sentenced in a proceeding that Lena did not attend, because she'd decided that her presence was not required for the thing to be real, and that the realness of it existed independent of whether she witnessed it. She read the sentence. She sat with it for an afternoon. Then she called Eli and they talked about his furniture situation for 20 minutes, and she didn't mention it, and he didn't ask, and that was, she thought, exactly correct. Carver, whose actual name emerged in the federal proceedings as a different name entirely, the name on that paper confirming the architecture of something that went higher than anyone had expected, was the subject of an ongoing process that Reyes had been honest about from the start. Longer, more complex, less certain in its outcome. The name on the paper generated a separate federal inquiry, one that would take years and might not produce the ending that the logic of the situation seemed to demand. Reyes told her this without apology, in the same flat, honest register she used for everything. Lena said she understood. She did understand. She had learned over the years of surviving the things she'd survived that the world did not guarantee the logic of its own outcomes, and that you did the work anyway, because the alternative was letting the thing stand. The work had been done. The rest would take the time it took. On an evening in late spring, Damien Vescari sat across from Lena Ashford in a neighborhood cafe, That was not the kind of place either of them would have been found 3 months ago. Small, warm, the kind that made its own bread and had the same 4 tables it had always had, and no particular ambition beyond being exactly what it was. She had found it by accident, walking home from the hospital, on a Tuesday when the light was doing the thing it does in spring, where it sits in the western sky longer than expected and turns everything the specific gold that doesn't have a name. She'd told him about it. He'd come. He looked different in the cafe light. Not less, not smaller or diminished, but differently lit, the way things look when you see them in a context that isn't the context where you first encountered them. She'd observed over 3 months of occasional dinners, and one afternoon in the park where Eli had made fun of both of them for being awkward about it, a quality when he was off guard that was at significant variance with the quality she'd first read in him. He was still, he was still precise, but underneath that, in the specific context of an evening where nothing was required of either of them, there was something that she thought might be the person he'd been before the decades of making himself into what the world he'd inhabited required. She thought that person was someone she would have liked in any context. She thought she liked him now, in this one. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and looked at her across the table and said, "How was the shift?" She said, "Long, good. There was a kid with a broken arm who wanted to talk about whether sharks could beat wolves, and I had 20 minutes and no strong opinions about apex predators, so I let him make the case." He said, "Outcome?" "Decisive shark victory. He was very thorough." Damien looked at his cup, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way she'd been cataloging for 3 months. Not quite a smile, the private adjacent thing. She'd decided she liked it better than a perform one would have been. She said, "The Reyes update came through." He nodded. "I saw it." She thinks the second phase indictments will move by fall. Maybe. He said it honestly. The maybe of someone who knew how these things moved. Maybe longer. But moving, he confirmed. She looked at her coffee. She thought about the voice message. She thought about standing in the stairwell of her building in the rain with the wrong number dialed and her back against the wall. She thought about 3 years of endurance that she'd been confusing with survival, and the 2 weeks that had demonstrated the difference, and the 3 months since in which she'd been doing the slow and unglamorous work of understanding what surviving actually felt like when it wasn't disguised as something else. She said, "I've been thinking about the message." He looked up. The wrong number. The thing that started. All of it. She turned the cup in her hands. "I was trying to call Priya. I was trying to send it to someone who already knew me, who would know what I meant, who would fill in the context from everything we'd already established." She paused. "Instead, I sent it to a number I'd never dialed to a person I'd never met." He said, "And?" She said, "And you listened to it 4 times. "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone answering a question with accuracy rather than speed. He said, "Because the first time I heard it, I understood what it actually was. Not an emergency, not a crisis call, something more specific than that. The voice of someone who had been alone with something for so long that saying it out loud to anyone at all was the only option left." He paused. "I've been that person. I recognize the quality of it." She looked at him. He held her gaze and didn't make it into anything more or less than what it was. She said, "You're different than I thought you were going to be." He said, "You're different than I thought you were going to be." "What did you think I was going to be?" He thought about it. Said, "Damaged in a way that would take a long time to work through. I was prepared for that." She said, "And instead you were exactly what you are." He paused, "which is something that happened to understand what it takes to survive, and is now figuring out what it takes to live, which is a different skill set and one you're approaching with the same quality you approach the other thing." She held that. It was, she thought, the most accurate description of her current situation she'd heard, including from herself. She said, "You're figuring out the same thing." He said, "I am." "How's it going?" He said, "Slowly. It's going slowly." He looked at his coffee. "I had a conversation with Marcus last week. He asked me what I was building now, going forward, what the structure was." He paused. "I didn't have a full answer. The partial answer I had was less, and more chosen, and nothing I'd need to explain to someone who asked directly. She said, "You've said that before, the explaining directly thing." "It's the bar I've settled on," he said. "It's high enough to actually mean something." She looked at him across the small table in the neighborhood cafe in the spring evening light and thought about a voice message sent to the wrong number in a stairwell during a thunderstorm, and the chain of things that had followed from it, the cost of it, the loss of it, the things that could not be recovered and the things that were still in process, and the things that had turned out to be different from what she'd feared. And she thought, this is the person who received it. This specific, still, imperfect, choosing to be different person. She picked up her coffee cup. She said, "I recorded a voice message this week. I do it sometimes when I'm on my way home instead of calling. Priya does the same thing. It's easier to say certain things that way." He said, "What did you say?" She said, "I said I was going home, that I was tired in a good way, that the shift was long, and I was looking forward to the walk." She paused. "That I wasn't scared anymore." He looked at her. She said, "I sent it to the right number this time." She held his gaze. "And I sent one to the wrong number too, after, on purpose." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did you say?" She said, "I said, I'm finally going home, and I said, I know you're going to be somewhere nearby." She looked at him across the table. "Are you?" He said, "Yes." Outside the cafe window, the spring evening was doing what spring evenings do, going gold and then going soft, the light leaving without drama, the street settling into itself. People passed on the sidewalk with the ordinary purposefulness of people going somewhere they meant to go. The world conducted its business. She finished her coffee. He finished his. They sat for a while in the comfortable quiet of two people who had come through something together and were now, carefully, and with the specific patience of people who understood what rushed things cost, figuring out what came after. There was no elegant resolution. There were outstanding legal proceedings and things that would take years, and a brother in a vocational program calling on Sundays, and a pediatric floor that needed nurses, and a man across a cafe table who was doing the slow work of becoming something different from what he'd been, and a woman doing the same work in parallel. There was the walk home through the spring evening afterward, the two of them on the sidewalk with the last of the gold light on the buildings, and no particular destination beyond the general direction of her apartment, her new apartment, a different address, the one she'd chosen deliberately and without emergency. There was the moment at the corner where they stopped and he said, "I'll go this way," because his car was parked north and her building was east, and she said, "Okay," and neither of them made a production of it. And there was the voice message she sent him from the corner, while she could still see him half a block away, that said, "I see you going the wrong way. You're going to have to come back around." And his reply, which was not a voice message but a text, just 3 words, "Already turning around." She walked home in the spring evening, and the fear that had lived in the stairwells and the wrong numbers and the back of every taxi and the corridor of the hospital and the space between sleeping and waking for 3 years was not gone. She was honest enough with herself to know it wouldn't be gone. Not entirely, not cleanly, but it was quieter. It had found its right proportion. It had become the appropriate size for the thing it was, a record of what had happened, not a prediction of what came next. She unlocked her door. She stepped inside. She turned on the light. She stood in the entry of her apartment, her chosen address, her door, and she thought about a woman in a stairwell who had said, "If I disappear, don't let them say I left." She was still here. She had not left. She hung up her jacket. She went to the kitchen and started water for tea. She opened the window to let the spring evening in. She was home. This is a work of fiction created solely for artistic and entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, locations, and events depicted are entirely